What would you do if the person you helped the most, the one you bent over backward for, the one you stayed late for, the one you charged almost nothing because you could see the worry in her eyes, turned out to be worth more money than you could count in a lifetime? Most people would feel cheated, angry, foolish. Ethan Cross felt none of those things. And that difference, that one small thing about his character, was exactly why his life was about to change forever. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The first thing Ethan Cross noticed every morning, before he even opened his eyes, was the smell. Motor oil, rust. The faint ghost of diesel that had soaked so deep into the concrete floor of the garage that no amount of cleaning would ever fully pull it out. 12 years of working in that smell, breathing it, wearing it home on his clothes and his hands and the back of his neck. 12 years, and it still hit him the same way every single morning, like a reminder that this was his life. This was what he'd chosen, or what had chosen him, or some combination of the two that he'd long since stopped trying to untangle. He lay on his cot in the back room for another 30 seconds, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since the winter before last, when a section of the roof had decided it was done holding itself together. He'd patched it with materials he couldn't really afford and tarped over the worst of it and told himself he'd fix it properly in the spring. That spring had come and gone. So had the next one. Ethan sat up, rubbed his face with both hands, listened to the silence of early morning in a town that didn't have much reason to be loud. Millhaven, Kentucky wasn't the kind of place that showed up on maps people actually used. It sat between two larger towns like something forgotten in a drawer. Not quite dead, not quite alive, just existing out of habit. A grain elevator. A diner that had been called Martha's even though no one living could remember a Martha. A dollar store. A church. A bar that had been a different bar when Ethan was in high school. And his garage. Cross Automotive and Repair, which sounded more professional than it was, with its hand-painted sign that was starting to peel on the left side, and its single hydraulic lift, and its inventory of parts he'd cataloged in a spiral notebook because the software subscription had been one of the first things to go when money got tight. He stood, pulled on his work pants, the dark blue ones with the iron-on patch on the left knee, and walked through the door that connected the back room to the shop floor. The Kellerman truck was still up on the lift. He'd been working on it for 2 days, chasing an electrical fault that kept hiding from him. Dave Kellerman had already called twice to ask about it, and both times Ethan had told him the same thing. "I'll have it ready when I have it ready, Dave." Kellerman was a decent enough man, but he was anxious about his truck the way some people were anxious about their firstborn, and there was no use trying to rush a wiring problem. You either found the fault or you didn't. Ethan made coffee on the 2-burner hot plate he kept on the workbench next to his socket set. The coffee was the cheap kind, the stuff that came in the big plastic can with the red lid, and it tasted like hot water that had been frightened by a coffee bean somewhere in its past. But it was hot, and it was his, and that was enough. He drank it standing up, looking out the window at the parking lot. 4 spaces, one of which was perpetually occupied by a Pontiac he'd accepted as partial payment on a job 2 years ago and hadn't been able to move since. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, turning everything the color of old brass. It would be hot today. Already, at 6:15 in the morning, the air had that thick, promising quality that meant temperatures in the mid-90s by afternoon. A summer Thursday in July. Nothing to distinguish it from any other day. He thought about money the way he did most mornings now. Not in a panicked way, not anymore. The panic had burned itself out somewhere around month 8 of the previous year, when he'd learned that you could only sustain that kind of terror for so long before your body simply refused to keep producing it. What replaced it was quieter. A low, steady pressure behind his sternum, like someone had placed a hand there and was pressing gently, but without any intention of stopping. The numbers were simple, and they weren't good. He had $642 in his checking account. The electric bill was due in 11 days, $215. The parts he'd ordered for the Kellerman job wouldn't be fully covered by what Dave was paying him. His supplier account had been put on net 30 terms because he'd been slow twice in the past 6 months, which meant he had to pay for his next order before he placed it. The liability insurance renewed in August, and his daughter Lily was starting 3rd grade in September, which meant school supplies. And there was a field trip fee that the school had sent home in an envelope with cheerful block letters on the front that he'd left face down on the kitchen counter. 7 years old. Second grade going into third. She was a serious child with her mother's eyes and his stubborn jaw, and she'd stopped asking him if things were going to be okay sometime last winter, which somehow felt worse than if she'd kept asking. He rinsed his coffee mug, put on his work gloves, went to the Kellerman truck, and picked up where he'd left off. By 9 o'clock, he'd have found the fault, a corroded connector behind the fuse box that a previous owner or a previous mechanic had half fixed with electrical tape and hope. He spent 40 minutes doing it right, using proper heat shrink tubing and fresh connectors, even though Dave Kellerman would never know the difference and would never care to know. But Ethan knew. That was the thing about doing work badly. It didn't bother the person who wasn't looking. It only bothered the person who was. He called Dave at 9:40. The truck was ready. Dave said he'd be by around noon. Ethan said fine, said the bill would be $310, and Dave said that all? And Ethan didn't answer that question because there wasn't a good answer to it. After he hung up, he sat on the rolling stool next to his workbench and looked at the appointment book. It was a physical appointment book, a thing with a spiral binding that he'd bought at the office supply place in Harlan because he'd tried the calendar app on his phone and found that he forgot to check it. The appointment book he could see. It sat on the corner of the workbench, and its presence was a fact. Today, Kellerman pickup. One oil change scheduled for 2 o'clock. Carol Simmons, who brought in her Buick every 4 months with a reliability that Ethan found genuinely comforting. Tomorrow, nothing. Next week, 2 things on Tuesday, then nothing until the following Monday. He turned the pages slowly. The summer had started slow and hadn't picked up. In the spring, there'd been a decent stretch. Farmers getting equipment ready for planting, people coming out of winter with vehicle problems they'd been ignoring since November. But that rush had passed, and what came after it was this. The quiet, the long hot afternoons with nothing but the sound of the fan in the corner and his own thoughts for company. He put the appointment book face down, the same way he'd put down the field trip envelope. The oil change was at 2. He'd just started on Carol Simmons' Buick when he heard gravel crunching in the parking lot. Not a car sound, something heavier. He ducked out from under the hood. A tractor was pulling into his lot. Old machine. Green and yellow, though the yellow had gone to something closer to cream in the way that paint does when it's been in the sun for decades. John Deere, he thought, and as it got closer, he revised. Late 1980s, John Deere 444. Oh, or close to it. The kind of machine that didn't quit easily, which was both a recommendation and a warning, because when a machine that didn't quit easily finally decided to quit, it usually had a long list of grievances it was presenting all at once. The tractor shuddered into his lot, belched black smoke twice, and then died. Completely. The engine sound cut off with a finality that Ethan had heard enough times to understand. That wasn't a machine that was going to start again on its own. The cab door opened. A woman climbed down. She was maybe 30, 32. Medium height, wearing clothes that were clearly work clothes, jeans with real dirt on them, not the kind that came pre-distressed from a factory, and a plain gray t-shirt with a small tear near the left shoulder. Her hair was dark brown and pulled back in a ponytail that had partially escaped, and she had the kind of tan you got from actually being outside, the kind that started at the collar and wrists rather than the face. She was carrying a small insulated bag, the kind you brought lunch in. Her boots were work boots, scuffed and resoled at least once. Everything about her said, farmer. Not hobby farmer, not wealthy enthusiast, farmer, someone who did the work. She stopped about 10 feet from him and looked at the tractor, then at him, with an expression that was tired and controlled, like someone who'd already spent the morning being frustrated and had run out of room to be more frustrated. I know it looks bad, she said. It is bad. When did it start acting up? Ethan asked, pulling off his work gloves so he could offer his hand. Ethan Cross, this is my shop. She shook his hand, firm grip. Sophia Langford. About 3 weeks ago, it started running rough in the mornings. I was hoping it would work itself out. That's never the strategy. I know that now. He walked toward the tractor. Mind if I take a look? That's why I'm here. He climbed up into the engine compartment and started looking. She stood near the front wheel, not hovering but not walking away either, watching him work with the calm of someone who understood that machinery required patience. "Smoke was black?" he asked. "Dark gray most of the time. Black twice this morning." "When you were pushing it hard or idling?" "Both," she paused. "I've got about 400 acres I need to get through in the next 2 weeks. Planting's already behind schedule." He looked up from the engine. "How behind?" "A week, maybe 10 days." She said it flatly, the way you stated a fact you'd already made peace with. "I had another machine go down 2 weeks ago. This one's been carrying the load for both." Ethan looked back at the engine and let out a slow breath. He could see 3 different things that needed attention right away, and he hadn't even pulled the injectors yet. This wasn't a quick job. This wasn't even a medium job. "Miss Langford," Sophia. "Sophia, I need to be straight with you. This isn't a same-day repair." "I figured. It might not even be a 2-day repair, depending on what I find once I'm deeper in." She nodded. "I need it back as fast as you can manage. What's a realistic timeline?" Ethan thought. "If the parts I'm thinking I need are in stock over in Harlan, I can have it back to you in 2 days, maybe 3. If they're not in stock..." "If they're not in stock?" "Then it depends on the supplier." "I don't have a depends," she said. "I need a machine." He looked at her again. The tiredness was more apparent now that he was looking for it, not just in her eyes, but in the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together with visible effort. He'd seen that particular kind of tired before. He saw it in his own mirror. "I'll do what I can," he said. "Let me pull it into the bay and get a proper look." The proper look was not encouraging. What Ethan found over the next 3 hours was a machine that had been maintained by someone who cared about it, but had been stretched past its sustainable limits. The fuel injectors on 3 cylinders were partially clogged. The primary fuel filter was completely gone, not dirty, not clogged, but absent, replaced at some point with a makeshift filter that someone had bodged together from materials he couldn't quite identify. The air intake manifold had a hairline crack, which explained the smoke. There was a hydraulic line that was weeping slowly from a fitting that had been over-tightened and was now starting to fail. And the injection pump. The injection pump was showing wear that suggested it was operating on borrowed time. He made a list. He priced it out on his phone, using the supplier website he checked daily out of habit. He wrote numbers on a yellow legal pad and added them up 3 times because the first 2 totals surprised him. Then he sat on the stool in the bay and looked at the yellow legal pad and thought. The parts, at what he paid, would run him around $1,800. Labor, this was a 2-day job at minimum, more realistically 2.5, should bill at around $1,200 on top of that. Full repair at honest rates, $3,000, give or take. He could cut his labor rate. He'd done it before for people he knew were stretched. The parts cost was the parts cost. There was no way around what he actually had to pay to order them. He went to find Sophia. She was in the small waiting area he had. 2 plastic chairs, a table with outdated magazines, a window that let in the afternoon light. She was sitting in one of the chairs with her back straight and her lunch bag on her lap, eating a sandwich. She looked up when he came in. "How bad?" she asked. He sat in the other chair, turned slightly toward her, and put the legal pad on his knee. "I'll walk you through it," he said, "because I want you to understand what you're looking at, not just see a number." He walked her through it. The injectors, the missing filter, the manifold crack, the hydraulic line, the injection pump. He showed her the legal pad. He explained what each item did and why it mattered. She listened without interrupting, eating her sandwich, watching him with the same steady attention she'd brought to watching him work. When he finished, she looked at the total. She was quiet for a moment. "Is all of that necessary right now?" she asked. "The injectors and the manifold, yes. Absolutely yes. The hydraulic line, yes, it's going to fail, and when it does, it'll take other things with it. The fuel filter situation is a safety issue, honestly. The injection pump..." He paused. "I'd be doing you a disservice if I told you it could wait, but it might get through your planting season before it gives out completely. And if it doesn't? Then you're calling me from a field 2 weeks from now." She looked at the pad again. Something crossed her face that he recognized. The specific expression of a person doing math they didn't like the outcome of. "What are my options?" she asked. It was a fair question. He'd had it asked of him in this room, in this chair, many times. Option 1, he said. I do the full repair, everything I listed. You've got a machine that should run another 10, 15 years if you maintain it. 3,000, maybe 3,200 when I'm done. Parts cost what they cost? I can't do much about that. My labor I can... He stopped. You can what? I was going to say I can work with you on the labor rate, depending on your situation. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not offended, not relieved. Something more careful than either. What's option 2? She asked. I do the essential repairs. The injectors, the manifold, the hydraulic line. Get you through planting season. You deal with the pump situation when the season's over and you've had time to plan for it. That comes down to about 2,200. Same thing on the labor. You don't have to do that, she said. Do what? Cut your rate. I'll pay what you quote. He looked at her. I'm going to quote you what the job is worth to me, not what it would be worth somewhere else. She held his gaze for a moment. Are you going to ask about my situation? No, he said. It's none of my business. The job is what it is. Something shifted slightly in her expression, something small and careful. Let's do the full repair, she said. He called the supplier at 4:15 and got lucky on most of it. The injectors were in stock. The manifold gasket set was in stock. The hydraulic fitting and line in stock. The injection pump, he'd have to order from a secondary supplier, which would add a day. He called Sophia to tell her. She picked up on the second ring. 3 days, he said. Possibly 4 if the pump delivery runs late. I'll let you know tomorrow where we stand. I appreciate that, she said. Mr. Cross? Ethan. Ethan, is there any possibility of you working on it tomorrow morning, early? I know it's a big ask. He thought of his appointment book, the 2 things on Tuesday. Tomorrow? Friday. Nothing. I'll be in the shop at 6, he said. I can start on it then. A brief pause. Thank you. That means a lot. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it's running. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Fair enough. Achieved. He picked Lily up from Mrs. Garrity's house at 5:30, the way he did every weekday. Mrs. Garrity lived 3 blocks from Lily's school and charged him $40 a week to watch her in the afternoons, which was less than the going rate, and something Ethan was quietly grateful for every single week. Lily was in the front yard when he pulled up, sitting cross-legged in the grass with a book open on her lap, her dark hair catching the late afternoon sun. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt and had a grass stain on one knee that was going to require some attention. When she saw his truck, she closed the book carefully, tucking a blade of grass in as a bookmark, and stood up. She was a deliberate child. She did things with attention and purpose, even small things. She got it from her mother, though Ethan tried not to think about that too much. He got out of the truck. She walked to him with the book under her arm, and he scooped her up, even though she was probably getting a little old for it. 7 was 7. And she didn't protest, just settled against his shoulder with the comfortable weight of a child who trusted the person holding her. You smell like the garage, she said. I live in the garage. You live above the garage. Same smell. She pulled back to look at his face. She did this sometimes, held his face in a direct gaze the way people 3 times her age usually couldn't sustain. Were you busy today? Got a big one this afternoon. Tractor. Those are good, right? Tractors cost a lot to fix. He put her down. Where did you learn that? You said it once. She took his hand. When the Beaumont people brought in their combine, you said combines and tractors were the jobs that kept the lights on. He stared at his 7-year-old for a moment. I forgot I said that. I remember things, she said, which was entirely true and had been true since she was about 4. He kept her hand as they walked to the truck. I made mac and cheese, he said. The good kind. From the box or the pot? From the pot. She considered this with appropriate gravity. Okay. He got to the shop at 5:50 the next morning. The delivery from Harlan would arrive by 8. He'd arranged it the night before, paying the $30 rush fee he didn't really want to pay because 2 days mattered more than $30. He started with what he had, pulled the injectors, cleaned the ports, began the manifold work. The shop was quiet at that hour, just the sounds of his tools and the radio he kept on the workbench, tuned to a country station he half listened to out of habit rather than preference. By the time the delivery arrived, he'd made substantial progress. He worked through the morning without stopping, eating a peanut butter sandwich over the engine at around 10:30. The hydraulic line took longer than he expected because whoever had installed the original fitting had used a thread size that wasn't standard, and he had to improvise an adapter. It took him 45 minutes to solve a problem that should have taken 10. At 1:30, Sophia called. "Just checking in," she said, not trying to rush you." "You're rushing me." A pause. "I'm sorry, I'm joking," he said. "It's going well. Injectors are done. Manifold's done. Hydraulic line took longer than I wanted. I'm on the injection pump now." "That's ahead of where I thought you'd be." "Don't get excited. I still have to put everything back together and run it for a while before I'm confident." "How long is a while?" "Long enough to know it's going to hold." Another pause. "That's a non-answer, Ethan." "It's an honest answer." "There's a difference?" "A lot of mechanics would give you a confident time and be wrong. I'd rather give you an honest time and be right." The silence on her end lasted long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. "You know what?" she said finally. "Never mind. Take the time you need." He set the phone face down on the workbench. Outside, the afternoon heat was hitting its peak, turning the air above the parking lot into a shimmer. The fan in the corner was doing what it could. His shirt was soaked through at the back, and he didn't notice. The tractor was ready Saturday morning. He'd run it for an hour Friday evening. In the parking lot, rev it up, watch the gauges, listen to the engine note, smell the exhaust. Then he'd let it cool and run it again. Then he'd made a short list of 3 things that were bothering him. None of them serious, all of them things he could address with an extra hour of work Saturday. He addressed them Saturday morning. The engine was tight. The exhaust was clean. The hydraulics moved the way hydraulics were supposed to move. He wrote up his final invoice on the form he kept in the top desk drawer, using his careful, slightly cramped handwriting that Lily once told him looked like serious writing. He looked at the total. He'd spent 11 hours and 40 minutes on the job. At his standard rate, the labor came to $702. The parts had run him $1,940. Full total, $2,642. He'd originally quoted her between $2,900 and $3,200. He thought about what she'd looked like sitting in that plastic chair, eating her sandwich, doing math she didn't like. He wrote the total on the invoice, $2,580. It was a $62 reduction from what the straight math said, which was a small thing. He added $10 for the rush parts delivery and then subtracted it again because he'd made the decision to order them that way and she hadn't asked him to. He crossed that line out. $2,580. When Sophia pulled in at 9 o'clock Saturday morning in a battered white pickup truck, the tractor was parked outside with a clean engine bay and all its panels back in place. Ethan was leaning against it with the invoice and the key. She got out of the truck and stopped. She looked at the tractor. "You detailed it," she said. "I cleaned the engine bay when I was done. Seemed right." She walked around it slowly, the way a person walks around something they've been worried about, looking for the thing that's still wrong. She didn't find anything. She put her hand on the hood, then opened the engine compartment and looked in. "You polished the manifold," she said. "I had a rag." She closed the compartment. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the machine with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Relief, maybe, but something more complicated underneath it. He handed her the invoice. She looked at it. Her eyebrows came together slightly. "This is less than you quoted." "I came in under on the labor hours." "By how much?" He scratched the back of his neck. "I rounded down." She looked up at him. "Ethan?" "The parts are exactly what they are. The labor number is what I feel comfortable charging. That's not the same as what it's worth. It's what I'm charging." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the invoice. "All right," she said quietly. She paid him in cash, which surprised him. She counted it from a plain white envelope she took from her jacket pocket. Exact amount. She handed him the envelope with the bills inside. He started to put it in his shirt pocket, then paused. "You want a receipt?" "I already have the invoice." "Right." She looked at him again with that careful, unreadable look. "You did exceptional work," she said. "I mean that. Not just the repair itself, the way you explained everything, the way you—" She stopped. "You treated me like my business mattered. It does matter. Not everyone sees it that way." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. She thanked him again, climbed up into the tractor cab, and started the engine. It came to life immediately, smooth and even, the way it should sound. No hesitation, no smoke, just a working machine. She looked down at him from the cab with an expression he couldn't quite name. Then she gave a small nod, put it in gear, and pulled out of his lot. The following Monday was quiet. The following Tuesday had his 2 scheduled appointments. He did them, went home, made dinner, helped Lily with the reading assignment her teacher had sent home for the summer. Charlotte's Web, which Lily was working through with great seriousness and occasional distress. "Does Charlotte die?" Lily asked him at the kitchen table, looking at him with an intensity that made him choose his words carefully. "You should find out when you get there," he said. "Dad?" "It's a book you're supposed to experience, not be told about." She looked at him with an expression of 7-year-old suspicion that suggested she knew perfectly well what that meant and didn't appreciate it. "Fine," she said, and turned the page. He watched her read for a minute. The kitchen light fell on the side of her face. She had a little crease between her eyebrows when she was concentrating, the same crease he saw in his own reflection sometimes. He thought about money, briefly, the way he did at kitchen tables and at stop signs and in the space between sleep and waking. The envelope Sophia had given him had paid the electric bill and replaced some supplies and knocked a chunk off the parts account. It had not solved anything. It had helped, and helping was not the same as solving. He thought about the way the tractor had sounded when she started it. That even working sound. He turned his attention back to his daughter and her book and the kitchen light, and he let the rest of it go for the night. Wednesday, he got a letter. Not a bill, not a flyer. An actual letter with his name on the envelope in printed type and a return address he didn't recognize. Langford Agricultural Holdings, Suite 1200, 40 Commerce Center Drive, Nashville, Tennessee, 37201. He stood in the parking lot in the morning heat and looked at the envelope for a moment, then opened it. The letter was brief, professionally typed, and signed by a person who identified herself as Melissa Crane, executive assistant to Ms. Sophia Langford. It informed him that Ms. Langford cordially extends an invitation to attend the Heartland Agricultural Innovation Summit, to be held in 14 days at the Music City Center in Nashville. The invitation included a complimentary conference registration, 2 nights at the Omni Hotel in downtown Nashville, and a personal note at the bottom of the letter in a different hand, smaller, less formal, that read, "Thought you might find this interesting. Come if you can. S.L." Ethan read the letter twice. Then he turned it over as if there might be something on the back, though there wasn't. He stood in the parking lot with the letter and thought about the woman who'd paid him in cash from a plain white envelope and eaten a sandwich in his plastic chair. Langford Agricultural Holdings. He went inside and sat at his workbench, opened the internet browser on his phone, the one he used for looking up parts prices and checking the weather. He typed, "Sophia Langford, Nashville." He looked at what came back. He sat with it for a long time. Well, the search results were not subtle. There were news articles and profile pieces and a Forbes mention from 3 years ago. There was a photograph, a formal one, from what looked like an industry event, of a woman in a dark blazer, her hair down instead of in a ponytail, standing at a podium with a confident, composed expression. It was the same woman. The same woman who'd climbed down from the cab of a 30-year-old John Deere with dirt on her jeans and a torn gray t-shirt. He read enough to understand the shape of it. Sophia Langford, 30 years old, CEO of Langford Agricultural Holdings, a company that had begun as her family's small farm operation and had been built over the past 7 years into one of the larger agricultural enterprises in the southeastern United States. Tens of thousands of acres under cultivation across multiple states, a portfolio of ancillary agricultural businesses, an office in Nashville and another in Louisville. Worth? The Forbes piece was careful about specific numbers, but it was not vague about the scale, easily in the hundreds of millions. Ethan put his phone face down on the workbench. He sat in the quiet of his shop, listening to the fan, feeling the heat of the morning building outside. She hadn't lied to him. She was a farmer. She'd never told him otherwise. She had a broken tractor and 400 acres that needed planting, and she'd come to the nearest repair shop because the machine was dead and she needed it fixed. He picked his phone back up. He looked at the invitation again, then he put both things down and went back to work, because there was a brake job coming in at 10 o'clock, and it wasn't going to do itself. He told himself he wasn't going to go. He told himself this for 4 days. He told himself the Nashville conference was for people who wore suits and knew what to say at networking events, and that he didn't own a decent suit anyway, and hadn't been to Nashville in 3 years and couldn't really afford 2 days away from the shop, even with the hotel paid for. He told himself all of this while, on the 5th day, he drove to the Goodwill in Harlan and found a sport coat that fit him well enough and a pair of dark pants that didn't embarrass him, and spent $28. He told himself he was just going to see what it was on the 6th day, while he called Mrs. Garrity to ask if she could keep Lily for 2 nights. And she said yes, without him having to explain much, because Mrs. Garrity had been in Millhaven long enough to understand the way things worked in a life like his. On the day before he left, Lily watched him trying on the sport coat in the bathroom mirror and made a face. "You look different," she said. "Different bad or different okay?" She considered it with appropriate seriousness. "Different okay, I think." "Why are you wearing a jacket?" "I'm going to a conference." "What's a conference?" "A lot of people in a building talking about the same thing." She absorbed this. "What's the thing?" "Farming. Agriculture." "You're not a farmer." "No," he said, looking at himself in the mirror. The sport coat, the still work-roughened hands. "I'm not." "So why are you going?" He turned away from the mirror. "Because someone invited me, and it seemed like the kind of thing you say yes to." Lily thought about this for a moment with the careful expression she brought to things that mattered. "Okay," she said, "but don't forget to call me." "Every night," he said, "and not late, early." "Early," he agreed. She nodded, satisfied with the terms, and went back to Charlotte's Web. Chuts. He drove to Nashville on a Thursday morning with the sport coat on a hanger in the back seat and the letter from Melissa Crane folded in his breast pocket. The Music City Center was a large modern convention facility downtown, and when he pulled up to the valet, he almost kept driving, because there were cars in that line that cost more than his garage, and the valet was wearing a uniform that cost more than his sport coat. He did not keep driving. He handed over his keys to a young man who did not look at the truck the way Ethan expected him to, and he walked through the doors of the Music City Center with the registration confirmation on his phone and found the check-in table and got his badge. The badge said, Ethan Cross/Cross Automotive and Repair/Millhaven, Kentucky. He clipped it to his jacket pocket and stood in the lobby of one of the largest agricultural conferences in the country, surrounded by executives and investors and academics and lobbyists, and he thought, I don't belong here. Then he thought, but I'm here. He got a coffee from the hospitality station near the registration desk, real coffee, not the frightened by a bean kind, and went to find a seat. The keynote was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. He had an entire afternoon and evening to get through first, and he filled it by attending 2 panels that actually interested him. One on modern diagnostic equipment for agricultural machinery, which he found technically engaging, and one on the economics of rural repair infrastructure, which made him feel, unexpectedly, like someone had been studying his life from the outside and writing notes. He called Lily at 7:30 from his hotel room. She told him that Charlotte had, in fact, died, and that she found this deeply unfair, and he agreed with her, and she said the book was still good, even though the ending was sad, which he thought was a sophisticated literary opinion for a 7-year-old, and told her so. Good night, Dad. Good night, Lil. He lay on a hotel mattress that was considerably better than his cot in the back room and stared at the ceiling, which did not have a water stain, and thought about what the morning would bring. He didn't know what Sophia intended. He didn't know why he was here. The honest answer was that he'd said yes because something in him had recognized the invitation as a door, and he'd learned enough about his life to know that you opened doors when they appeared because they didn't always appear again. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the hotel room settle around him. Whatever it was, it would be tomorrow. The morning of the keynote, Ethan woke at 5:15 without an alarm. Old habit, the body didn't know it was in a Nashville hotel. The body thought it was in the back room of a garage in Millhaven, Kentucky, and that there was work to do. He lay still for a minute, looking at the ceiling of a room that was nicer than any room he'd slept in recent memory. The air conditioning was running quietly. The sheets were a thread count he couldn't identify, but that were noticeably different from his own. Outside, 14 floors below, downtown Nashville was beginning its slow negotiation with the morning. Delivery trucks, a siren a few blocks away, the sound of the city finding its footing. He got up, showered, stood in front of the bathroom mirror with the sport coat on a hanger behind him, and tried to decide if he looked like someone who belonged at a major agricultural conference or like a mechanic who'd borrowed someone else's jacket. The answer, he decided, was probably both, and there wasn't much he could do about it either way. He put on the jacket. It fit across the shoulders the way the Goodwill attendant had promised it would when she'd suggested he try it. He straightened the collar. He looked at himself for a moment with the kind of honest appraisal he usually reserved for engines, identifying what was actually there rather than what he wished was there. He was 32 years old. He had calluses on both hands that no amount of lotion would fully soften. There was a small scar on his left forearm from a fan belt incident 6 years ago. His face had the particular weathering of someone who spent time working outdoors in a Kentucky summer, and the lines around his eyes were the kind that came from squinting at things that needed fixing rather than from laughing, though he did some of that too. He looked like what he was. That was going to have to be enough. He went down to the conference center at 7:30 and got breakfast from the buffet that the hotel had set up in one of the side rooms: eggs, toast, orange juice that came out of a dispenser. He sat alone at a table near the window and watched the other early arrivals filter in. Men in suits that had been pressed that morning, women in blazers with conference lanyards already around their necks, the particular kind of organized, purposeful energy that belonged to people who did this regularly, who moved through spaces like this without the slight hesitation that Ethan couldn't entirely suppress. He drank his orange juice and listened to the conversations happening around him. Acquisitions. Yield projections. Something about a trade policy that kept coming up. A company called Novacrop that several people seemed to have opinions about. The language was specific and confident, the language of people who knew exactly what they were talking about and assumed everyone around them did too. Ethan knew agricultural machinery. He knew fuel systems and hydraulic lines and why a 30-year-old John Deere sounded different from a newer one. He knew the smell of an engine that was working versus one that wasn't. He knew how to read a problem by the quality of the smoke coming out of the exhaust, the same way a doctor read something by the color in a patient's face. He didn't know what Novacrop was. He refilled his coffee and went to find his seat in the main hall. The hall was large. That was the first impression. The sheer scale of it, the rows of chairs arranged in wide arcs facing a raised stage at the front, a stage with a podium and a backdrop screen that was currently showing the conference logo in a rotating animation. There were easily 2,000 seats. Most of them were filling up. The noise was the particular noise of a large, expectant crowd. Not loud exactly, but present, a continuous undertow of voices and movement, and the click of dress shoes on hard floors. Ethan found a seat in the middle section, not too close to the front, and not so far back that he'd feel like he was hiding, though some part of him wanted to be further back. He settled in, put his badge flat on his knee, and watched the room fill up around him. The people near him were in conversation with each other, the way people were when they came to these things in groups, with colleagues or contacts they'd arranged to sit with. The man to his left was on his phone, typing something rapidly. The two women in front of him were reviewing something on a shared tablet, occasionally pointing to items on the screen with the practiced efficiency of people reviewing the same document for the 4th or 5th time. Ethan sat with his coffee and waited. At 5 minutes to 9, the house lights went down slightly. The conversational noise tapered. Someone from the conference, a moderator or an MC, a polished man in his 50s with the kind of voice that filled a room without effort, came to the podium and welcomed everyone and said a few things about the agenda and housekeeping items and the importance of the agricultural sector to the national economy. Standard opening remarks. Ethan had heard the structure of speeches like this before, even if not at this scale. Then the moderator said, "It is genuinely my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. In 7 years, she has taken a family farming operation in rural Tennessee and built it into one of the most significant agricultural enterprises in the country. She operates across 11 states, employs over 800 people directly, and has become one of the most respected and, honestly, one of the most interesting voices in American agriculture. Please welcome to the stage, Sophia Langford." The applause started immediately and built fast. Around Ethan, the entire audience rose from their seats, not gradually but as a single motion, the way a crowd moved when it had been waiting for something. Ethan stood with them because not standing would have been strange, but his eyes were fixed on the figure walking out from the wing of the stage, and his brain was doing something that took a moment to resolve into a coherent thought. The woman walking to the podium was wearing a dark navy blazer over a silk blouse, her dark hair down and carefully styled. She moved with the ease of someone who had walked onto stages before, who had made peace with being looked at. Her posture was straight. Her expression was composed in the way that you only composed yourself when you'd had to learn how. He recognized the jaw, the way she held her head when she looked at something directly, the careful quality of her attention. He sat down slowly when most of the audience sat down, and his coffee cup was in his hand and he didn't remember picking it up. The woman whose broken tractor he'd spent 2 days fixing. The woman who'd sat in his plastic waiting chair and eaten a sandwich and asked him honest questions about her engine. The woman who had paid him in cash from a plain envelope and thanked him for treating her like her business mattered. She was standing at a podium in front of 2,000 people who had just risen to their feet for her. He sat with this information for a moment, the way you sat with something that rearranged the furniture of your assumptions, and waited for the feeling to clarify into something he could name. It didn't quite, so he listened. Sophia Langford let the applause settle, and when she spoke, her voice was different from the voice he remembered from the waiting room and the phone calls. Not different in character, but different in projection. Calibrated for the room, for the scale of it. She thanked the moderator. She thanked the conference. She said she was glad to be there, and it sounded like she meant it, which was harder than it looked. Then she said, "I want to talk about something that doesn't come up a lot at conferences like this one. I want to talk about honesty, not the buzzword version of it, not brand transparency or stakeholder trust metrics. I mean the old kind, the kind that costs something." The room was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that meant 2,000 people were paying attention. 7 years ago, she continued, I had 16 acres and a loan that made me physically sick to look at. My father had started the operation and handed it to me when his health made it impossible for him to continue. And the truth is, and I'll say this plainly, I didn't know if I could do it. I had a business degree and a lot of theory and zero practical confidence. What I had was farmers who'd worked that land longer than I'd been alive, and I made a decision early on that I was going to learn from them before I started telling them anything. She paused. Not for effect. He'd seen enough pauses for effect to recognize a real one. This was a real one. What I learned from those people, the actual workers, the mechanics, the equipment operators, was that integrity wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a brand value you put on a slide deck. It was a daily decision that most people made quietly, without anyone watching, without any expectation of reward. Another pause. And I learned to recognize it, because you see it in the work. Ethan's badge was still flat on his knee. He looked at it without reading it. Last month, Sophia said, I drove a tractor down to a small town in Kentucky because my equipment manager was out sick and I didn't want to wait. The machine was in bad shape. My fault, I'll admit it, because I'd pushed it harder than I should have over the spring. Something in her delivery shifted, slightly. Not a big shift. You'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. I found a repair shop on the side of a county road. One bay. Hand-painted sign. No website, no reviews online. Nothing. Just a phone number on a piece of plywood. The audience was very still. The mechanic who came out to look at the machine. He didn't know who I was. I want to be clear about that. He had no idea. I was a woman with a broken tractor and dirty jeans and a concern about the bill. That was it. She looked out at the audience, and even from the middle section, Ethan had the sudden disorienting feeling that she was looking at him specifically, though that was probably not possible from that distance. He spent 2 days on a repair that most shops would have rushed through. He called me with updates. He explained every single line item so I understood what I was paying for, and when he handed me the invoice, it was less than he'd quoted. She stopped again. Not because I'm a billionaire, because that was who he was. The room was still. I've worked with a lot of service providers over 7 years, she said. I've dealt with vendors who told me what I wanted to hear, contractors who cut corners they thought I wouldn't notice, partners who were a different version of themselves when they thought the person they were dealing with had no leverage. And then I met a man who just did the work, charged what was fair, treated me like I mattered because I was a customer with a problem, not because of what I might represent. She reached under the podium, and Ethan heard the small click of a microphone being adjusted. I am going to ask that man to stand up, she said. And his heart, which he would have said had become fairly well calibrated against surprises, did something entirely uncontrolled. Ethan Cross, she said into a microphone in front of 2,000 people. Ethan, you're here somewhere? You want to stand up? Every head in the room turned. Not one or two heads, all of them, sweeping across the audience in the way that heads moved when someone said a name in a room full of people and the person with that name was somewhere in the middle of it. Ethan Cross sat very still for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough time to have a clear, simple thought. I could pretend I'm not here. Just sit with his eyes forward, badge turned over, let the moment pass. He was wearing a Goodwill sport coat in a room full of people who had never heard of him, and standing up was exactly the kind of thing he did not naturally do in crowds. But the badge on his knee said Ethan Cross/Cross Automotive and Repair/Millhaven, Kentucky in printed type that was perfectly legible to the woman in the seat next to him, who had already turned to look at him with an expression of polite expectation. He stood up. There was a moment, a brief, terrible moment, where he was just standing in the middle of a large room while 2,000 people who didn't know him looked at the man the woman on stage had just described. He had no idea what his face was doing. He kept his hands at his sides because there was nothing else to do with them. Then the applause started. It wasn't the same applause they'd given Sophia when she walked out. That had been the applause of recognition, of familiarity. This was something different. It had a different quality to it. It built slower, but it got louder. And people near him were turning toward him with expressions that were genuinely warm, not politely warm. The difference was something you could tell, if you'd spent enough time reading the small variations in how people looked at you. He stood there. He felt his face do something he didn't have a word for. He nodded because he needed to do something, and sitting back down too quickly seemed wrong, and standing for too long also seemed wrong, and he had not been given any instructions for how to handle any of this. He nodded at the stage and at the audience, and then he sat back down, carefully, in the way you sat down when you just had more attention than you'd experienced in the last several years combined. The woman next to him, the one who'd seen his badge, leaned over. "That was you?" she said. Her voice was quiet, just for him. "Yeah," he said. "The mechanic?" "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment. That was a remarkable thing she just said about you. He didn't know how to answer that either, so he just looked back at the stage where Sophia Langford had waited for the applause to settle and was now continuing her speech with the composed, measured quality of someone who knew exactly what she'd just done and had planned every beat of it. She spoke for another 20 minutes about supply chain integrity, about what she called the overlooked workforce, the mechanics, the equipment operators, the independent contractors who kept agricultural operations functional, about the gap between how those workers were valued and how essential they actually were. She spoke without notes, as far as Ethan could tell, or with notes she'd internalized so completely that they were invisible. She was very good at this. That was the objective assessment. She was someone who had figured out how to fill a room without filling it with noise, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, the audience stood again. Ethan stood with them, which felt strange given that he was still processing being mentioned by her to them. And he clapped with everyone else. And the morning light was coming through the high windows of the conference center, and the sound of 2,000 people applauding moved through his chest like something physical. Afterward, the moderator announced a 20-minute break before the next panel. The crowd began to move toward the exits, toward the coffee stations, toward each other in the immediate clustering of people who had things to say after something worth talking about. Ethan stood in the middle of the motion, still holding his empty coffee cup, not quite sure where to point himself. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized. "Now, can you come backstage? SL." He looked at the text for a moment, then he found a trash can for the coffee cup, asked a passing conference volunteer where the backstage access was, and followed the directions down a side corridor with a temporary sign that said "Authorized Personnel." Keynote. And an usher in a polo shirt who looked at his badge, looked at the text Ethan showed him on his phone, and stepped aside. Backstage was smaller than he expected. A practical space, not glamorous, with exposed cable runs and a few folding tables and a rack of audio equipment. Two people with headsets were talking to each other. A third was wrapping a cable with the methodical care that belonged to someone who wrapped cables every day of their professional life. Sophia was standing with a glass of water and a man in a charcoal suit who was speaking to her in a low, rapid voice with the body language of someone delivering information on a schedule. She was listening but tracking the door, and when Ethan came through, she said something brief to the man in the charcoal suit, who nodded and moved away with the efficiency of someone used to being excused. She walked toward Ethan. In person, in this context, she was different again from the woman in the waiting chair and different again from the woman at the podium. Not a different person. The eyes were the same, the directness was the same. But the layers of context around her were different. Here she was, the person who'd just spoken to 2,000 people, in a jacket that probably cost more than his monthly parts bill, her hair professionally done. And yet she was walking toward him with the same straightforward gaze she'd had when she'd climbed down from the tractor cab. "You came," she said. "You invited me." "I wasn't sure you would." She stopped about 4 feet away. "I thought you might think it was strange." "I did think it was strange," he said. "I came anyway." A slight shift at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "How did you feel, being up there?" "Like I wanted to sit back down." "You handled it well." I stood and nodded. "That's not handling it well. That's just surviving it." She looked at him for a moment directly, the way she'd looked at him across his workbench in Millhaven. "I should have told you," she said, "when I brought the tractor in, who I was. You told me you were a farmer. I let you assume the rest." "I didn't assume much," he said. "You were a customer with a broken machine. That was the relevant information. And if you'd known?" He thought about it honestly. "I'd have done the same job, maybe been more nervous about it." She studied him. "I don't think that's entirely true." "Maybe not entirely," he admitted. "But mostly." A person with a headset appeared at her shoulder. "Miss Langford, 10 minutes." She held up a finger without looking at them. The headset person stepped back. "Ethan," she said, "I want to have a real conversation with you. Not right now. I have 3 more obligations this morning that I can't cancel. But tonight, dinner. I made a reservation at a place downtown. Will you come?" He looked at her. The question behind the question was obvious. This wasn't just dinner. There was something she wanted to say or propose or offer, and the backstage of a conference center 20 minutes after a keynote was not where she intended to say it. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come." 7 o'clock. The reservation's under Langford. The hotel concierge can give you the address. She paused, then added, "Bring your appetite. They don't do small portions." He almost said, "That's fine. I'm used to small portions." But he stopped himself because it was too honest in a way that was also too pathetic, and he'd rather keep some things. "All right," he said instead. She nodded, and then the headset person was back with more insistence, and Ethan turned and found his way back through the corridor and out into the lobby, where the conference break was in full swing and he needed to stand still for a moment and let the morning settle around him. He spent the rest of the conference day doing what you did when you were attending something that was only partly about the programming, moving through it, sitting in on a session that held his interest for about 40 minutes before his mind pulled back to the evening and what it might be, getting lunch at the buffet and eating it at a corner table while a man across the room gave an impassioned talk about predictive maintenance software that Ethan would have found genuinely interesting on a different day. He called Lily at noon. "How's the conference?" she asked. "It was a morning," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means something happened that I didn't expect, and I'm still thinking about it." "Good? Unexpected or bad unexpected?" "I honestly don't know yet." "Dad." She said his name the way she said it when she was being patient with him, which was a tone he recognized from her mother's side of the family. "Just tell me." So he told her. Simplified, edited for a 7-year-old who didn't need all of it, but the basic shape. The woman whose tractor he'd fixed had been at the conference, had told a story about him in front of a lot of people, had asked him to stand up. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Were you embarrassed?" she asked. "A little. But also maybe not all bad embarrassed?" He smiled at the phone, there in his corner of the conference lunchroom. "Yeah," he said, "not all bad." "You should go to dinner," she said, with the confidence of someone who had only the most uncomplicated relationship with decisions like this. "If she wants to talk to you, you should talk." "Mrs. Garrity says you need to eat dinner before 7. "I eat early anyway," Lily said, unconcerned. "Bring me something from Nashville." "What kind of something?" "Something that's not mac and cheese." He laughed, a genuine one, unguarded, there in the corner of the lunchroom. "I'll see what I can do," he said. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus didn't have prices on them, which Ethan noticed immediately because he was the sort of person who always checked prices first, and the absence of them was its own information. Sophia was already there when he arrived at 5 to 7, at a corner table with a clean line of sight to the door. She'd changed from the blazer to a dark green dress, her hair still down, and she stood when she saw him come in. Not formally, just standing the way people stood when they spotted someone they were expecting. "I thought you might drive home instead," she said. "I thought about it," he said honestly. She smiled at that. A real one, the first complete one he'd seen from her. It changed her face. "Sit down," she said. "They have a steak here that's worth the trip from Kentucky on its own." He sat down. The waiter appeared and Sophia ordered wine, asked him if he had a preference, and he said he didn't, so she picked something she said was good, and he trusted that. He ordered water too because he didn't want to be in a conversation like this one with wine being the first thing that hit his system. "You know what I think?" Sophia said after the waiter left. "I think you've spent the whole day trying to figure out what this is." "I have," he said. "And?" "I don't know. I thought it might be a thank you, but you could have mailed a thank you note and saved yourself a hotel room." "I gave you the hotel room." "You know what I mean?" She picked up her water glass. "It's not just a thank you. You're right about that." She set it down. "Can I be direct with you?" "I'd prefer it." "The story I told this morning. I didn't tell it to embarrass you. I told it because I needed the industry to hear it. About what integrity actually looks like, not in a corporate mission statement, but in practice, in a real interaction." She held his gaze. "And the reason I could tell that story with confidence is because what you did was unambiguous. You didn't cut your rates because you thought I might have money. You didn't do extraordinary work because you knew who I was. You just did it. That's rarer than you know, Ethan." He looked at the tablecloth for a moment. There was a small asymmetry in the weave pattern, barely visible. "I did the job the way I do the job," he said, "which is my entire point." The wine arrived. She tasted it, nodded to the waiter, who filled both glasses and withdrew. "I want to offer you a contract," she said. He looked up. "Langford Agricultural Holdings operates roughly 260 pieces of equipment across 11 states. Tractors, combines, heavy transport trucks, specialized irrigation systems, smaller utility vehicles. We have a fleet management team, but our on-site maintenance capability is inconsistent. We use a patchwork of different shops in different areas, and the quality varies enormously, significantly." She paused. "I want to change that." He sat with this for a moment. The restaurant noise moved around them. Other conversations. The quiet sound of silverware. Someone laughing across the room. "What does changing it look like?" he asked. "It looks like a dedicated maintenance contractor who operates as our primary repair partner. Someone whose shop we can route equipment to and trust. and whose judgment we rely on for assessments and diagnostics. Staged expansion. We don't dump everything on you at once because that would be bad for both of us. We start with the equipment that operates in a 100-mile radius of Mill Haven, which is roughly 40 machines right now. We evaluate. We grow from there. He picked up his wine glass and then set it back down without drinking from it. Sophia, I have a one-bay shop. I know. I have one hydraulic lift and an inventory system in a spiral notebook. I know that too. I can't service 40 pieces of equipment in a one-bay shop. Which is why, she said, the contract would include a capital development component, an advance against future work that you'd use to expand the facility. Hire technicians, acquire equipment. The advance would be offset against the contract billing over time. It's not a gift, it's a business structure, but it gives you the ability to scale to what the work requires. He stared at her. You'd finance my expansion. Against contracted work, yes. Why not just hire your own mechanics, build an internal team? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which he appreciated. Because internal teams develop internal habits. They take shortcuts because they're employees, and employees do what they think is acceptable rather than what's actually right. What I saw in your shop was someone who does the right thing because he can't help it. That's not something you hire for. That's something you find, if you're lucky, and then you build around it. Ethan looked out the window at the Nashville street. A couple was walking past with a small dog, and the dog was very interested in a fire hydrant, and the couple was very patient about it. Normal things, ordinary things. He looked back at Sophia. I'd need to know the numbers, he said. Of course. Real numbers. I'm not a... He stopped. I'm good at what I do. I'm not sophisticated about contracts. I have lawyers for that. I'd suggest you get one too, or at least someone who can review the paperwork. I'd expect that. I wouldn't trust someone who didn't. And if I expand and then the contract ends? That's a legitimate concern. She said it directly, without trying to minimize it. The honest answer is that I can't guarantee the future of any business relationship. What I can tell you is that I built a company on the understanding that you get out of a partnership what you put in, and if the partnership isn't working for both sides, it shouldn't continue. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away from it. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why me specifically? There are better equipped shops, bigger operations, people with the infrastructure already in place. He paused. What happens if I expand and I can't hold the quality? What happens if I hire 6 people and 2 of them are bad and I can't catch it? Sophia's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. Not the confidence, but the texture of it. Those are exactly the questions I'd expect someone serious to ask, she said. Not the excited version of someone who just heard a big number. I'm not there yet, he said. The big number part. I know. She tilted her head slightly. You want to know why you specifically? The honest answer is what I said this morning, but I'll say it without the stage and the microphone. You treated me like my problem mattered. Not my money, not my influence. My problem. That's the foundation I want to build a maintenance partnership on, because the alternative is people who are careful when they think someone's watching and careless when they don't. And in an agricultural operation, careless costs you a harvest. Ethan looked at the table, back at her. I have a daughter, he said, 7 years old. I've been making decisions for the past 5 years based on what's stable, not what's exciting, because stable is what she needs. This is stable, Sophia said. Done correctly. This is more stable than what you have right now. He knew that was true. He also knew that the distance between what was true and what you could see clearly when you were sitting in the middle of it was sometimes considerable. I need to think about it, he said. I'd be concerned if you didn't. I need to go home and look at my shop and think about it from inside the shop, not from here. That's exactly what you should do. She picked up her menu. Will you eat dinner first? He picked up his own menu. The entrees were listed without prices. Yeah, he said. I'll eat dinner. Good, she said. The steak. Trust me on that. He found the steak on the menu and read the description. It involved words he associated with restaurants he'd never been to. He ordered it anyway, because Lily had told him to bring his appetite, and he'd left his appetite in Kentucky and was working with what was available. They talked through dinner, not about the contract. That conversation had a boundary on it, a mutual acknowledgement that it was finished for the night and would need a different context to continue. They talked about other things. She asked about Lily, and he told her about Charlotte's Web and the grass stain and the blade of grass bookmark. And Sophia listened with the kind of attention that meant she was actually listening rather than waiting to speak. He asked about the company, not the numbers, but the actual work, what it looked like from the inside. She talked about the first years, the grinding incremental reality of building something when you didn't have money to waste on mistakes. She talked about the workers she'd learned from, an equipment operator named Doyle, who'd been working the land since before her father and who had initially had no patience for her and had eventually become one of the people she trusted most. What changed it? Ethan asked. With Doyle. I asked him to teach me, she said. Not manage, not advise, teach. There's a difference, and he knew the difference. Did he? He tested me first, gave me wrong information about a piece of equipment, and watched to see if I'd just take it or if I'd verify it myself. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That's a hard test. He was a hard person. She looked at her wine glass. He's retired now. Sends me emails with terrible grammar and very good advice. The restaurant noise moved around them. The steak was, as promised, excellent, a fact Ethan registered with the mild guilt of someone who rarely ate something that good and wasn't sure he deserved to. They finished dinner. The waiter brought the check and Sophia took it before it touched the table. I've got it, she said, in a tone that did not invite discussion. Ethan let it go. Thank you, he said. I brought you here. It's mine. All right. They walked out of the restaurant together onto the Nashville sidewalk. The evening had cooled slightly, as Nashville evenings sometimes did, the heat dropping out of the air after dark, leaving something that was merely warm rather than pressing. There was foot traffic on the street, a Friday night crowd, people moving toward restaurants and bars with the easy energy of people who weren't carrying the week on their shoulders anymore. Sophia stopped on the sidewalk. I'll have my people send you the preliminary contract terms next week, she said. Read them. Get someone to look at them with you. Ask every question you have. I will. And Ethan. She looked at him directly in the sidewalk light. Whatever you decide, thank you. For the tractor, for the way you did it. He looked at her. You already thanked me. In front of 2,000 people. I know. The corner of her mouth moved. That was the professional thank you. This is the other one. He nodded. She nodded back. Then her car, a car that had been waiting, he noticed, a detail he'd missed earlier, pulled to the curb, and she got in, and the car pulled away. And Ethan Cross stood on a Nashville sidewalk in a Goodwill sport coat, with a business proposal sitting in the back of his mind like something he'd have to drive home and look at from every angle before he knew what it was. He stood there for a while. The city moved around him. Down the street, someone was playing music outside a bar, something with a good rhythm, and the sound drifted over on the warm air. He took out his phone and looked at the time. 10:15. Too late to call Lily. He typed a text instead. Dinner was good. Going to sleep. Tell you everything tomorrow. Love you. She'd see it in the morning. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and walked back toward the hotel, thinking about a contract he hadn't read yet, an expansion he hadn't planned for, a decision he hadn't made, and a 7-year-old girl who'd told him to bring something back that wasn't mac and cheese. He thought he knew what the decision was going to be. He wasn't ready to call it that yet, not standing on a sidewalk at 10:15 on a Friday night in a city that wasn't his. But he thought he knew. The music followed him half a block before the city noise swallowed it. He drove back to Mill Haven the next morning. Nashville disappeared in the rearview mirror the way cities did when you left them. Gradually, the skyline shrinking, the highway opening up, the density giving way to the long, rolling country of Middle Tennessee, and then the rougher terrain of eastern Kentucky, the hills getting steeper and the trees closer to the road. He had the windows down for the first hour because the morning air was still cool enough to be worth it, and the sport coat was on the hanger in the back seat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he was back to being himself in the way that you were only fully yourself when you were in a space that didn't require you to be anything else. He thought about the contract proposal the whole drive home. Not obsessively. He didn't have the mental space for obsession, and he'd long since learned to think about things the way he diagnosed engines, methodically, one system at a time. He thought about what it would mean for the shop. He thought about what expansion looked like in practical terms. More bay space, at minimum, which meant either building an addition or finding a larger location. More equipment. At least 2, probably 3 additional mechanics to start, which meant HR considerations he had no experience with, payroll, insurance. He thought about the supply chain implications, about having to maintain parts inventory for dozens of different machines across multiple equipment types, rather than the more manageable variety he dealt with now. He thought about what it would mean for Lily. That was the one he kept coming back to, pulling at it from different angles the way you pulled at something that mattered to see if it held. What it would mean for her if it worked. What it would mean if it didn't. He stopped for gas outside of London, Kentucky, and stood at the pump in the morning heat watching the numbers turn over, and he thought about what Sophia had said at dinner. This is stable. Done correctly. This is more stable than what you have right now. She'd said it with confidence, but she'd also acknowledged, when he pressed her, that no business relationship was guaranteed. Both things were true. The way most important things were true. Incompletely, conditionally, with qualifications that mattered. He got back in the truck and drove the rest of the way home. Millhaven looked the same. That was always the slightly disorienting thing about leaving a small town for even a few days. The complete indifference of the place to your absence. The grain elevator was there. Martha's Diner was there. The dollar store, the church, the bar. His garage sat where it had always sat, with its peeling sign and its single bay, and the Pontiac in the parking lot that he still hadn't moved. He pulled in, sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, looking at the building. It was a small building. He knew that. He'd always known that. But standing in the conference center in Nashville and then coming back to look at it, the gap between those two things was a specific distance that he hadn't measured before and was measuring now. He got out of the truck. He unlocked the shop and went inside. The smell hit him the same way it always did. Motor oil, rust, old diesel. His. He put the sport coat on its hanger on the hook near the door, the hook he used for his work jackets. He changed into his work pants. He made coffee on the 2-burner hot plate. He stood at the window with his mug and looked at the parking lot and the weeds growing up through a crack in the asphalt near the far edge that he'd been meaning to spray for 3 weeks. He thought, what would this look like if it were bigger? Not a fantasy version, a real version. 2 more bays would require the unused land to the east of the building, which he owned. He'd owned it since he bought the property 6 years ago and had always intended to expand, the same way he'd always intended to fix the roof properly and spray the weeds. He'd intended a lot of things that had remained in the category of intention because intention required capital, and capital had been the thing he perpetually didn't have enough of. He drank his coffee. He thought. He didn't make any decisions that morning because he'd learned early that the decisions you made the morning after something significant were usually the impulsive ones, and the decisions you made after sitting with something for a week were usually the honest ones. What he made that morning instead was a list, not a pros and cons list. Those were for people who thought the world sorted neatly into columns, which it didn't. What he made was a questions list, things he needed to know before any decision was possible. Contract terms, payment structure, scope of work, liability, exit conditions, expansion requirements, minimum facility size, equipment needs, timeline, personnel, what skills he'd need and where he'd find them, legal review, who he was going to call, because Sophia was right that he needed someone and he currently didn't have a business lawyer, had never needed one. He wrote the list in the spiral notebook he used for inventory, filled 2 pages. Then he put it on the corner of the workbench where the appointment book sat, and he went to work on a carburetor that had come in before he left for Nashville and had been sitting covered in the corner since Wednesday. He needed to think with his hands. He always had. The contract documents arrived Tuesday. A 41-page PDF from Melissa Crane, executive assistant to Ms. Sophia Langford, with a cover letter that thanked him for his attendance at the summit and expressed, in the careful language of corporate correspondence, that Ms. Langford hoped the enclosed terms were the beginning of a productive conversation. He printed all 41 pages at the library in town because his printer was out of ink and he couldn't read a 41-page document on his phone without losing his mind. The librarian, a woman named Ruth Ann, who'd been at the Millhaven Library since Ethan was in elementary school, watched him collect the pages from the printer tray with the particular discretion of someone who'd seen a lot of things come through the library printer and had learned not to comment. He took the pages home, sat at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, read all 41 pages once, quickly, to get the shape of it, then went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly, with a yellow highlighter and a pen. There were things he understood and things he didn't. The scope of work section he understood. It described a maintenance contractor relationship covering agricultural equipment within a defined radius, with provisions for mobile service calls and workshop repairs. The billing structure he understood. The performance metrics he understood, though some of them gave him pause. Response time requirements, documented completion rates, customer satisfaction scores that would be gathered from Langford's equipment managers on a quarterly basis. Those were reasonable. He'd hold himself to standards like that regardless. The sections he didn't understand were the indemnification clauses and the warranty language. They were long and dense and written in the kind of legal architecture that had been designed over generations to be nearly impenetrable to people who hadn't spent 3 years in law school. He called Marcus Webb the next morning. Marcus had gone to the same high school as Ethan and had then done what Ethan hadn't. Left, gone to college, gone to law school, built a practice in Harlan that handled a mix of things, including some business law and contracts. They weren't close friends, hadn't been in 15 years, but they were the kind of acquaintances who existed in small region relationships where the history of knowing someone was longer than the recent contact. "I heard you were at the conference in Nashville," Marcus said, when Ethan had explained why he was calling. "People talk." "People in Millhaven don't have anything else to do," Ethan said. "Send me the documents. I'll look at it, tell you what I think." "What do you charge for something like this?" Marcus named a number that was lower than Ethan had expected. "That's my going rate for a first review. If it gets complicated, it gets more complicated. We'll talk if that happens." "Appreciate it, Marcus. Don't appreciate it yet. I might tell you it's a bad deal." "That's what I'm paying you for." He sent the PDF. Marcus came back to him 4 days later on a Saturday morning with a call that lasted 55 minutes and covered every section Ethan had highlighted and several he hadn't. The bottom line, according to Marcus, the contract was not aggressive. The terms were, in Marcus's assessment, fair to slightly generous on your side, with 2 exceptions. The performance metrics had real teeth. Consistent failure to meet the documented response times would trigger a contract review process that had clear termination provisions. And the liability language needed a writer specifying the extent of Ethan's exposure if a maintained piece of equipment failed in a way that caused damage or injury, because as currently written it was slightly ambiguous about whether his shop's exposure was capped or open-ended. "Those 2 things I'd negotiate," Marcus said. "Everything else, I've seen worse from people who were trying to be fair." "She's trying to be fair," Ethan said. "I know what I see in the documents. Negotiate it anyway." The performance metrics. The response time requirements. 12-hour response for an equipment down situation. That's aggressive when you're talking about a one-man operation. You need that to scale with your workforce. If you have 3 mechanics and 1 is sick and 1 is on a job, 12 hours might not be realistic. Make it a tiered requirement. 12 hours with a full crew, 24 during periods of documented staffing shortage. Ethan was writing in the spiral notebook. "Okay. And the liability cap. Get it in writing, I'll draft the language." "What do you think about the deal overall?" Ethan asked. "Not the legal part. The deal." A brief pause. "That's not what you're paying me for." "Marcus. I'm a lawyer, not a business consultant. You grew up in Harlan County. You know what it looks like when someone from outside comes in with a deal that sounds good." Another pause, longer. "This doesn't read like that," Marcus said more carefully. "The capital advance structure is real. I've seen extraction deals, and this isn't one. The offset against future work is standard and reasonable. What I'd tell any client is, the deal is only as good as the relationship, and I can't tell you what the relationship is." "The relationship is good," Ethan said. "Then negotiate the 2 things, get the language right, and make a decision you can live with. He thanked Marcus, hung up, sat at the kitchen table in the Saturday morning quiet while Lily was still asleep, and made the decision he'd been circling around since Nashville. He picked up his phone and called Sophia. She answered on the third ring. Ethan, I read the contract. And? 2 things I want to negotiate. A pause that had something in it he couldn't identify. To relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or both. Tell me. He told her. The tiered response requirements, the liability cap. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the liability cap is reasonable. I'll have Melissa get you the revised language by Monday. A brief pause. The performance tiers, I want to push back slightly on the staffing shortage definition. I need it to be objective, not self-reported. If you say you're short-staffed, I need your employment records to reflect that. That's fair, Ethan said, which means you'll need to keep proper employment records. I know how to keep records. Spiral notebooks aren't employment records. He looked at the spiral notebook on the table in front of him. I'll get proper software. Good. A pause. Is that the list? 2 things? That's the list. Ethan. Another pause. Are you going to sign it? He put his hand flat on the table, looked at his palm, the calluses, the scar from the fan belt, the permanent shadow of grease in the lines that even a thorough scrubbing never fully cleared. Hands that had been doing this for 12 years. Hands that knew one thing very well and were being asked to grow into something larger. Yeah, he said. I'm going to sign it. The pause on her end this time was short. Okay, she said. Good. She said it simply, without performance, which he appreciated more than he would have appreciated something more elaborate. I want to start slow, he said. Not because I'm not committed to the scope, because I want to do it right. I'd rather grow into it than overpromise and underdeliver. That's what I'd want too. And I need 60 days before the first equipment comes to my shop. I need to hire at least 1 mechanic before I start taking on your volume. 60 days works. I'll have my fleet coordinator reach out to you in 3 weeks to start mapping the equipment locations and priority units. She paused. Do you have someone in mind for the mechanic position? He thought of a name immediately, with the clarity of someone who'd been thinking about it on and off since Nashville without quite admitting that to himself. Maybe. I'll let you know how it goes. They said goodbye. He sat at the table for a moment. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair doing what it did in the mornings. Serious chaos on one side, collapsed flat on the other. Holding her Charlotte's Web in one hand and looking at him with the particular assessment of a child who'd heard the tail end of an adult phone call. That was the tractor lady, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Good news or complicated news? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, blade of grass bookmark, crease between her eyebrows. Complicated news that I think is good, he said. She came and sat in the chair across from him, put the book on the table face down to save her page. Tell me the non-complicated parts. So he did. He kept it simple. There was a company that needed a lot of machines fixed and they wanted his shop to do it. He was going to need to make the shop bigger and hire some people to help. Lily listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment with the book in front of her. Is it scary? She asked. He thought about it honestly, because that was the agreement they had. A little. Is it good scary or bad scary? I don't know yet. She absorbed this. Charlotte was scary at first, she said. In the book, but she turned out to be important. He looked at his daughter. Are you comparing this situation to a spider? I'm saying sometimes things that seem scary are actually important, she said, with the slightly exasperated patience of someone whose metaphor had been slightly too literally received. Fair point, he said. She picked up her book, then put it down again. Dad? Yeah. The school trip, the one Mrs. Calloway sent home about. He thought of the envelope he'd put face down on the counter. It was still there. He'd moved it to the kitchen counter, which meant it had moved from face down to face down in a different location. Yeah, he said. It's $35, she said. I looked. He met her eyes. 7 years old, and she'd looked up the price because she knew he would. and she wanted to have the information herself instead of waiting to find out from the envelope. "I know," he said. "You're going." She held his gaze for a moment. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She looked at him for another second, with the evaluating expression she had that was too old for her face, in a way that had nothing to do with precocity and everything to do with circumstance. Then she nodded, picked up her book, and went back to her room, and Ethan Cross sat at the kitchen table in the Saturday morning quiet and turned the word yes over in his mind, like something he was just getting used to the weight of. The man he'd thought of was named Dale Pruitt, and he was 54 years old and had been the lead mechanic at the John Deere dealership in Harlan for 19 years before the dealership was bought by a regional chain that brought in their own team and restructured the existing staff out of existence with the particular corporate politeness that made getting fired feel like a scheduling adjustment. Ethan had known Dale for years, not closely, but in the professional way of people in the same trade in a small region, bumping into each other at supplier pickups, or running into the same diagnostic mystery and trading notes. Dale was the kind of mechanic who approached a machine the way a surgeon approached a patient, with respect, with attention, and with the quiet conviction that carelessness was a moral failing rather than just a professional one. He called Dale on a Monday. "I heard you were thinking about expanding," Dale said immediately, before Ethan had gotten through more than 2 sentences. Ethan stopped. "Where did you hear that?" "Ruth Ann at the library mentioned you'd been printing out a long contract document. In Millhaven, that's a headline." "That woman," Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Yes, I'm expanding. I'm looking for a lead mechanic. I thought of you." A pause. "What does the work look like?" "Agricultural equipment primarily. I've contracted with a company called Langford Agricultural Holdings to be their primary maintenance provider in this region. It'll start with their equipment and may grow beyond that." "Langford." Dale was quiet for a moment. "That's Sophia Langford's operation." "You know her?" "I know of her. She bought 4 8R series tractors from the dealership in Harlan about 4 years ago. Paid cash, which I remember because nobody pays cash for a 400 series tractor." Another pause. "What are you paying?" Ethan named a number that was honest. Better than Dale's last position, he suspected, but not inflated. He wanted the man who'd come because the work was right, not because the number had closed the gap on good judgment. Dale was quiet for several seconds. "Can I come see the shop?" "I'd expect that." Dale came on Wednesday morning. He walked through the space slowly, the way a person walked through something they were imagining rebuilt, pausing at the hydraulic lift, looking at the ceiling, crouching to look at the floor in the corner where Ethan had been meaning to fill a crack for 2 years. He opened the storage cabinet and looked at the parts inventory. He picked up the spiral notebook from the workbench, looked at it, and set it down without comment, which itself was a comment. Then he stood in the middle of the bay and looked at Ethan. "What does expansion look like?" he asked. Ethan told him. The adjacent land, the plan for 2 additional bays, the equipment acquisition timeline based on the capital advance from Langford. Dale listened without interrupting, which was a quality Ethan had learned to read as either disinterest or the deepest form of attention, and in Dale's case was clearly the latter. "You'd have the title business owner," Dale said when Ethan finished. "What does that mean practically? Are you going to be hands-on, or are you going to be management?" "I'm going to be both," Ethan said. "I don't know how to not be hands-on. When things get bigger, you're going to have to figure it out. When things get bigger, I'll deal with that. Right now, I need someone who knows agricultural equipment at a level I trust." Dale put his hands in his pockets. He was a tall man, lean in the way of people who'd spent decades doing physical work without ever having to think about it. He had gray at his temples and a way of standing that suggested a person who had made up his mind about most things and was selective about what he revisited. "I'll take it," Dale said. Ethan looked at him. "You're not going to think about it?" "I've been thinking about it since you called on Monday." "That's 4 days." "Some decisions take 4 days." Dale pulled his right hand out of his pocket and offered it. "When do we start?" Ethan shook it. 6 weeks. I need permits, and I need to at least break ground on the addition before I can bring in a second body. I'll be here in 6 weeks. Dale looked around the bay one more time, the assessing look of a man already solving problems that didn't officially exist yet, You're going to need to do something about that crack in the floor before you pour anything new. I know. And the roof on the south side. I know. And the... Dale? Yeah. I know about all of it. That's why I'm doing this. Dale almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. All right, he said. 6 weeks. The permits took longer than 6 weeks. They took 10 because the county building office moved at the speed of a county building office, and because the site survey turned up a drainage question that required a separate consultation, and because 2 of the 3 contractors Ethan called for the addition either didn't call back or gave him a number that assumed he was someone else. He found the right contractor through Dale, who knew a man in Harlan named Victor Reyes who did commercial builds at honest rates and had a crew that showed up when they said they would, which Victor presented as a basic professional standard and which Ethan found, by contrast with his earlier contractor conversations, genuinely refreshing. The capital advance from Langford hit his business account on the 31st day after he signed the contract, in a transfer that was preceded by an email from Melissa Crane with wire transfer details and a note from Sophia that said simply, "Use it well. Talk soon." He looked at the number in his account for a long time. Then he called Victor Reyes and told him to start. The construction was disruptive in the way that building onto a working shop was always disruptive. Dust and noise, and the parking situation becoming a daily improvisation. He ran the shop through it, doing repairs around the construction schedule, apologizing to customers about the inconvenience, in a way that most of them accepted with good grace because Millhaven was a place where people understood that building something took time and mess. Lily came to the shop on Saturdays. She had a standing arrangement with Ethan that Saturdays were her day to be at the garage, sitting at the workbench with her books and her homework, and recently, a spiral notebook of her own in which she appeared to be writing something she would not show him. She took this arrangement seriously. She arrived at 8:30, accepted a hot chocolate if the weather called for it, or a glass of juice if it didn't, and installed herself at the workbench with the self-contained purpose of someone who knew exactly what they were there to do. She also, he noticed, had started paying attention to the construction. She watched Victor's crew with focused interest and once asked one of the workers, a young guy named Chris, what the purpose of a specific piece of framing was. Chris had explained it to her with more patience and detail than she'd probably expected, and she'd listened carefully and then written something in her notebook, which Ethan saw her do from across the bay. "What are you writing?" he asked her one afternoon over the sound of the nail gun from next door. She looked at the notebook, then at him. "A story." "About what?" "About the shop." She paused. "About you, kind of." He put down the socket wrench he'd been holding. "About me." "About someone like you." She turned the notebook slightly away, the instinctive protection of a person who wasn't done yet. "It's not done." "Okay." "You can't read it until it's done." "I won't." She looked at him with the evaluating look, then appeared satisfied that he meant it and went back to the notebook. He went back to the job he was working on, a transmission overhaul on a truck that had come in from 2 towns over, referred by a farmer who'd heard about the Langford contract from someone at the co-op and had decided that a shop Sophia Langford trusted was probably worth the extra drive. That had been happening. Not a flood, a trickle. A few new customers who'd heard something or heard about something and had made their way to Millhaven with their problems. Word traveled in rural communities through the mechanisms that had always moved it. Conversations at feed stores, mentions at church, the reliable gossip infrastructure of the co-op and the diner. What had traveled was not the full story. Most people didn't know the full story, but a version of it. That mechanic in Millhaven, the one who fixed Sophia Langford's tractor. Good work. Fair prices. That was enough. That was more than enough. He was thinking about this, in the idle way you thought about things while your hands were doing something else, when his phone rang. He looked at it. Sophia. He wiped his hand on a shop rag and answered. "Hey, how's the construction going?" "Slower than I wanted, and exactly how fast Victor said it would go." A sound that was almost a laugh. "That's a contractor truth right there. He said 8 weeks from permit. We're at 6. The framing is up on both new bays. Electrical is next week." Good. A pause that had something purposeful in it. I'm calling because I have something I want to discuss, and I wanted to call rather than email. He straightened up from the transmission, because this was a standing straight conversation. Okay. My equipment coordinator, a man named Phil Derry, is going to be in your area Friday. He manages our regional fleet, the 40 machines we've assigned to your contract initially. He wants to come and meet you, see the facility, get a sense of how you work. That's reasonable. It is. But I want to prepare you for Phil. Ethan waited. Phil has been with the company for 11 years. He was skeptical of this contract from the beginning. Not because of you personally. He doesn't know you personally. Because his instinct is always toward larger vendors, established operations, more infrastructure than you currently have. He advocated internally for going with a regional chain out of Lexington. Ethan took that in. And you overruled him. It's my company, she said, without apology. But Phil is good at his job and his concerns were legitimate from a risk management perspective, and he's going to come to your shop looking for reasons that he was right. You're telling me this why? Because I want you to know what you're walking into, not to change how you operate. Don't change how you operate. But so you're not blindsided if he asks hard questions. Ethan looked at the transmission on his workbench. The work in progress, half finished, doing what work always did, waiting for him to come back to it. What kind of hard questions, he said. Capacity questions, staff questions. He'll want to see your documentation system, how you track work orders, parts, maintenance history. He'll want to know how you handle emergency calls when you're already at full capacity. He's going to look at the construction and see how far it is from done and calculate whether the timeline is real. The timeline is real. I know that. Show him. Sophia. He paused. What happens if he goes back and makes a compelling case against the contract? A pause that was measured rather than uncertain. He can make whatever case he wants. He's my coordinator, not my board. The decision is made. Another pause. But I'm not going to pretend that his confidence in the arrangement doesn't matter operationally. He's the one who'll be managing the relationship day to day. If he walks into your shop Friday and walks out dismissive, that's going to make things harder than they need to be. So you want me to impress him. I want you to be yourself and let that do what it does. He almost said, that's a nice sentiment, but it's not an answer. But he stopped because she had given him the real answer already. About Phil's concerns, about the documentation system, about what the man would be looking for. That was the preparation. The rest was the work. I'll be ready Friday, he said. Ethan. A pause. The documentation system. I know. The spiral notebook. I know, Sophia, I'm getting software. I sent you an email 2 weeks ago with 3 recommendations. He had, in fact, not opened that email. I'll look at it tonight. Tonight, she said, in a tone that was not quite a warning. Tonight, he confirmed. She hung up. He stood in the bay for a moment, holding his phone with the transmission unfinished in front of him and the framing of the new bays visible through the temporary plywood wall that separated the existing shop from the construction. He thought about Phil Derry, 11 years with the company, advocating for a regional chain from Lexington, walking into this space on Friday with the practiced eye of someone who knew what operational capability looked like and what it didn't. He thought about Dale, who was starting in 3 days. He thought about Victor's crew and whether the electrical could be moved up, and whether the answer was almost certainly no because you couldn't move up electrical, but the question was worth asking. He thought about the spiral notebook on the workbench and the management software email sitting unread in his inbox. He thought about Lily writing a story about someone like him in a notebook she wasn't ready to show yet. He pulled up the email. Read the 3 software recommendations. Looked at the pricing and the feature lists with the same methodical attention he brought to diagnostic specs. Picked the one that had the best documentation trail and the clearest mobile interface, because half his work happened away from a desktop and he needed something he'd actually use. He set it up that evening at the kitchen table, entering his existing work orders manually, building the system from the present rather than pretending the past was something he could reconstruct. It took him 4 hours. His eyes hurt by the end of it, and his coffee had gone cold twice. But when he finished, he had a system that Phil Derry could look at on Friday and see that it was real. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9:15 when she should have been asleep. "You're still up," he said. "I was writing." She looked at the laptop screen. "What are you doing?" "Setting up software. For the shop." She came and looked over his shoulder, looked at the screen for a moment. "It looks organized." "That's the point." "Is it for the Friday visit?" He looked at her. "How do you know about the Friday visit?" "I heard you on the phone." She didn't say it with any guile. She'd heard him and she'd registered it because that was the way her mind worked. "Is the man coming going to be difficult?" "Probably." "Are you nervous?" He considered giving her the reassuring answer and then didn't. "A little, yeah." She put her hand on his shoulder. Not a hug, just a hand, brief and matter-of-fact. Then she went back down the hall without saying anything else, and he heard her door close softly, and he sat at the kitchen table with the software screen in front of him, and the shop quiet, and the night settling in around the house that sat above the garage that had always been the thing keeping them both afloat, and he thought about what it meant to build something that could hold more weight than it currently held. He finished the setup, closed the laptop, looked at the dark kitchen window. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days was enough time to be ready. He had learned over 12 years of doing this that ready didn't mean perfect. Ready meant you'd done the work you could do and you'd show up honestly with what you had, and you'd let that be the answer. It had always been the answer. He was still learning to trust that it always would be. Phil Derry arrived at 9:40 on Friday morning, 20 minutes late, in a gray company truck with the Langford Agricultural Holdings logo on the door. A clean, simple design, just the initials, and a wheat stalk that managed not to look like every other agricultural company logo Ethan had ever seen. He was a compact man, mid-40s, with close-cropped hair going salt and pepper at the sides, and the particular kind of efficiency in his movements that belonged to people who had been managing large operations for long enough that wasted motion had simply been edited out of them. He wore a collared shirt with the company logo on the chest and work pants that were clean but not new, which told Ethan something about him before he opened his mouth. He got out of the truck and looked at the shop the way Ethan might have looked at an engine he'd just been handed, with the quick, comprehensive scan of someone building a preliminary assessment before committing to an opinion. His eyes went to the sign, the parking lot, the Pontiac that was still there, the construction visible behind the main building. He took maybe 4 seconds to do this. Then he walked toward Ethan with his hand out. "Phil Derry," he said, "Fleet Coordinator, Southeast Region." "Ethan Cross." They shook. Phil's grip was the grip of a man who used his hands and wasn't performing. "Come in." He'd spent the 3 days since Sophia's call getting the shop ready in every way he could get it ready. The floor crack had been filled. The workbench had been organized with the kind of deliberate clarity that came from removing everything and putting back only what had a reason to be there. The new management software was running on a tablet mounted near the main workstation, displaying the current work order log in a way that was legible from a reasonable distance. The temporary plywood wall between the existing shop and the construction had been cleaned up, the debris cleared, so when you looked through the open section you saw framing and concrete and electrical conduit in progress, which was the honest state of things, but at least it was an organized, honest state of things. Dale was in the bay working on the first piece of Langford equipment they'd received for a scheduled service, a utility tractor that Phil's team had sent over 2 weeks ago as what Ethan understood to be a test run. Dale had spent 2 days on it with the kind of thorough attention he brought to everything, and it was currently on the lift with Dale's legs visible beneath it, the clean scrape of a socket wrench audible. Phil noticed Dale immediately. "That's your lead mechanic?" Dale Pruitt, 19 years at the Harlan John Deere dealership before it was bought out. Phil's expression shifted slightly in a way that wasn't quite visible unless you were looking for it. "I know the Harlan operation, good reputation." "Dale is the reason it had one." Phil walked toward the lift. "Dale," he said it loud enough to carry. Dale rolled out from under the tractor on the creeper, looked up at Phil without particular expression, and said, "That's me. Phil Derry. I manage the fleet that's going to be coming through this shop." "I figured," Dale said. He didn't stand, didn't perform, just looked up at Phil from the creeper with the equanimity of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone before 9 in the morning or after. You want to know what I found? Yeah. Hydraulic filter was 3 months overdue for service. Somebody changed the engine oil but missed the hydraulic. PTO engagement is sloppy. There's wear on the clutch pack that's been building for a while. I'd rate it at about 60% of design specification. Left rear tire is losing about 4 psi a week. Slow leak at the valve stem. Easy fix, but it'll get worse if it's ignored. He paused. Whoever did your last service on this unit cut some corners. Phil's jaw moved in a way that was not quite a wince. Who's been servicing it? You'd know better than I would, Dale said. I'm just telling you what I found. Phil looked at the tractor. Looked at Dale. A brief assessing look that had something in it besides skepticism. The beginning of something else, though it hadn't resolved into anything yet. Write it up, Phil said. It's already written up. Dale gestured toward the tablet on the workstation. Work orders in the system, parts needed, labor estimate, completion timeline. Phil walked to the tablet, read the work order, read it again. He had the concentrated look of a person reading something twice, not because they didn't understand it, but because they were verifying that they understood it correctly. He turned back to Ethan. Show me the rest of the facility. Ethan walked him through it. The main bay, the storage and parts area, the small office, which was really a corner with a desk and a filing cabinet, and the tablet setup, but organized enough to function. Then outside, through the gap in the temporary wall, into the construction zone where Victor's crew was running electrical conduit in the framing of the first new bay. Victor himself was there, a compact man in his 50s with a yellow hard hat and the unhurried competence of someone who'd been building things in Kentucky for 30 years and had stopped being interested in appearing busy. Ethan introduced them. Victor shook Phil's hand and, without being asked, walked him through the construction timeline with the same directness he'd used with Ethan from the beginning. This was what was built. This was what remained. This was the completion date, assuming no more drainage surprises, which he'd already addressed. And the second bay, Phil said, looking at the framing. When is that complete relative to the first? 6 weeks behind, Victor said. We're phasing it. First bay fully operational in 4 weeks. Second bay 10. Phil looked at the framing. He had a way of looking at things that was thorough without being rude, methodical rather than critical, though the distinction was sometimes thin. He walked to one of the framed openings and looked out at the land behind the building, the land that Ethan had owned for 6 years and never used. You own this property? He asked. I do, Ethan said. All of it? To the tree line. Phil did the math quietly. You could see him doing it, the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant numbers were being arranged. That's enough for a third bay if you needed it. Eventually, maybe. Not eventually. Eventually is now, in this industry. Equipment doesn't wait. Ethan looked at him directly. I'm not going to overbuild before I know what the actual demand looks like. I'd rather have the capacity I need and earn more than have more than I need and carry the overhead while I figure it out. Phil looked at him for a moment. That's a cautious position. It's an honest position. Something shifted in Phil's expression, not softening exactly, more like an adjustment of calibration. He looked at the construction once more, then turned back toward the main shop. They went back inside. Phil sat down at the desk in the office corner and Ethan pulled the second chair around, and Phil opened the laptop he'd been carrying and set it on the desk between them, and they went through things in the way that a fleet coordinator and a contractor went through things. Methodically, specifically, without sentimentality. Phil asked about response times. Ethan walked him through the tiered structure he'd negotiated, the 12-hour and 24-hour tiers based on documented staffing. Phil looked at the tiered language in the contract summary on his screen, and Ethan could see from the small tightening around his eyes that this was one of the provisions he had opinions about. The tiered response is a concession from Sophia's standard terms, Phil said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I know. I negotiated it because I wasn't going to promise something I couldn't deliver when my crew is one person short and I've got 2 machines already down. The Lexington operation runs 12 hours flat, Phil said. No tiers. The Lexington operation has 8 bays and a staff of 14, Ethan said. You want to compare me to them in 2 years? I'll have that conversation. Right now I'm comparing me to me, and what I can honestly deliver is the tiered model. Phil looked at him. You know I advocated against this contract. Sophia told me. The pause that followed was the kind that happened when someone found out they'd been disclosed and had to recalibrate how to proceed. Phil leaned back slightly. She told you that. She told me because she wanted me to be prepared, not to put me on the defensive and not to put you at a disadvantage, just to prepare me. Phil's mouth moved in a way that was almost something. That's very Sophia, he said, not unkindly. Is it? She believes in information. He looked at the screen. She thinks most problems come from people not having the right information at the right time, and she fixes it by giving everyone the information and letting them deal with it. He paused. It's effective, mostly. Also, occasionally uncomfortable. Ethan almost smiled. I noticed. Phil looked at the work order system on the tablet. Walk me through how you track a job from intake to completion. Ethan walked him through it. The intake flow, the diagnostic documentation, the parts ordering integration, the technician assignment, the completion sign-off that generated the customer record automatically. He'd built the workflow over the past 3 weeks in pieces, learning the software at night after Lily was in bed, making mistakes and correcting them, building something that was genuinely functional rather than impressive-looking and empty. Phil asked questions throughout. Good questions. Specific, targeted, the questions of someone who knew what could go wrong in a fleet management relationship and was checking whether Ethan had thought about those same things. What happened when a part was back-ordered and a machine was down? How Ethan communicated status to the equipment manager? What the escalation path was if a repair revealed a larger problem than initially diagnosed and the cost estimate needed to change? Ethan answered each one. Not all of them perfectly. There were 2 where he said flat out that he hadn't fully worked out the protocol yet, and he said what his working plan was and acknowledged that it needed refinement. He didn't dress those answers up. He gave them straight. Phil made notes on his laptop. He made a lot of notes. Whether the notes were positive or negative was impossible to read from his expression. At 11:30, Phil closed the laptop and looked at Ethan across the desk. I want to be honest with you, Phil said. That's what I'd want. When Sophia told me she was contracting with a one-bay shop in Millhaven, Kentucky, my first reaction was that she'd let a good personal experience override good operational judgment. I've seen that happen before. Someone meets an impressive individual and extrapolates that to mean the organization around them is equally impressive, and usually the organization isn't. Ethan held his gaze and didn't say anything. Phil was still talking. What I'm seeing here is different from what I expected to see, Phil said. The work order on that utility tractor is more thorough than anything I got from the Lexington outfit on the same type of machine. Your lead mechanic identified a problem that Lexington's last service missed entirely. Your documentation system is functional and it's being used, which sounds like a low bar, but you'd be surprised. He paused. The facility is not what it's going to be, but I can see what it's going to be, and the plan is credible. Ethan waited. I still have concerns about capacity during the expansion period, Phil said. If 3 machines come down simultaneously in month 2 and your second bay isn't operational, I need to know how you handle that. I bring in a mobile unit, Ethan said. I've already identified 2 used service trucks I can acquire within the capital budget, and Dale can run mobile calls while I hold down the shop. It's not the same as having 3 bays, but it's a real answer. Phil looked at him for a moment. You thought about that before I asked. I thought about every version of 3 things going wrong at once that I could come up with, Ethan said. Because that's what happens. A pause that was different from the earlier pauses. Something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but shifted in the way that things shifted when 2 people who'd started as adversaries found an unexpected common ground. All right, Phil said. He opened his laptop again, typed something brief. I'm going to recommend to Sophia that we proceed on the original timeline. I'm also going to recommend that we add a 30-day review at the 60-day mark to assess capacity against actual volume. Not a punitive review, an information review, so we can adjust if the volume is higher than anticipated. That's reasonable, Ethan said. I'll also recommend that we assign you a dedicated contact on my team, someone who knows the equipment and can give you complete service histories. You shouldn't be going in blind on machines you haven't seen before. I'd appreciate that. Phil closed the laptop again and stood, and Ethan stood with him. They shook hands at the desk. "You know what I think?" Phil said, holding the handshake for a moment. "I think Sophia was right. I don't say that easily." "I appreciate you saying it. Don't thank me. I'm still going to hold you to the metrics." He released the handshake. "But I'm going to do it in good faith." "That's all I'd ask for," Ethan said. Phil picked up his laptop and walked out of the office corner and through the bay, pausing for a moment near the lift where Dale was still working. Dale had apparently followed enough of the conversation to know roughly how it had gone, because he gave Phil a brief nod as he passed that contained a calibrated amount of acknowledgement. Phil gave a brief nod back. Then he walked out to his company truck, got in, and drove out of the lot, and Ethan stood in the doorway of his shop and watched the truck turn onto the county road and disappear in the direction of the highway. Dale rolled out from under the tractor. "Well," Dale said, "he's going to recommend we proceed." Dale grunted. "I figured when he stopped arguing." "Was that what that was?" "That's what a man who's changing his mind looks like," Dale said. "He stops pushing and starts asking different questions." He sat up on the creeper and stretched his back with the practiced motion of someone dealing with a decade of concrete floors. "He's competent, that one." "Yeah," Ethan said. "He is." Dale stood and went back to the tractor, because there was still a clutch pack that needed attention, and a valve stem that needed replacement, and work that didn't stop because a meeting had gone well. Ethan went back to the transmission overhaul he'd put aside for the morning. The shop fell back into its working rhythm. The sound of tools, the radio on the workbench, the distant noise of Victor's crew running conduit in the framing next door. The first 4 months of the Langford contract were hard, in the way that growing pains were always hard. Not bad exactly, but grinding. Work that came in faster than the systems could comfortably process it, problems that didn't have precedence in Ethan's experience, and required him to research solutions he'd never needed before. A John Deere 8R with a fault code he'd never seen on that model that turned out to be a software issue requiring a firmware update he had to get from the manufacturer's dealer network, which took 3 days and 4 phone calls. A hay merger with a hydraulic failure that was straightforward to fix but happened on a Tuesday morning when Dale was on a mobile call 60 miles away and the machine was needed in the field by afternoon, and Ethan had to make a call to a contact in Harlan to send a loaner implement while he worked the repair, which cost him $200 he hadn't budgeted for. He documented everything, every job, every complication, every decision he made that was outside the standard protocol. He wrote detailed notes in the management system with the thoroughness he'd always brought to the physical work, because he'd learned that what you didn't write down had a way of being forgotten at exactly the moment it became relevant. The 30-day review came and went. Phil Derry called, went through the numbers, noted that response times were tracking above the contractual requirements, noted that the utility tractor service had been completed with a quality rating from the equipment manager that was the highest the manager had given any service provider in 3 years. Noted 2 instances where parts availability had caused delays that bumped against the performance thresholds, and discussed them with Ethan in the specific, unemotional way that Phil discussed everything. Not to blame, but to understand and prevent recurrence. Ethan had already thought about both instances. He'd adjusted his parts inventory protocols, adding 3 additional units of the highest failure risk components for the specific equipment models in the Langford fleet to his standing stock. It cost him money he'd budgeted carefully to have, but the alternative, waiting on parts and failing a response window, was more expensive in every way that mattered. "You already addressed it," Phil said when Ethan told him. "Before you called." "Good." Phil paused. "The second bay is on track?" "Victor says 2 weeks. Does that mean 2 weeks, or does it mean Victor weeks?" "In this case, Victor means Victor. He's been accurate every step so far." "All right." A pause. "Sophia wants to expand the scope in Q2, add another 18 machines from our Central Kentucky cluster. I want to see how the next 6 weeks go before I sign off on that." 6 weeks is fair. I know it's fair. I'm telling you because I want you prepared for the possibility." Another pause. "Don't get comfortable." "I'm not," Ethan said. "Good." Phil hung up. Ethan put the phone down and looked at the shop. Both bays running, Dale at one lift and a second mechanic named Tanya Birch at the other. Tanya had come to him through a referral from Dale, a 38-year-old woman who'd done diesel mechanics in the Army for 8 years and commercial equipment repair for 6 years after that, who was efficient and exacting and had no patience for shortcuts, which meant she fit the operation the way a correct part fit a machine. He'd hired Tanya 4 weeks in, when the volume made it clear that 2 people was not 3 people, and 3 people was what the work required. She'd walked into the shop on her first day, looked around with the comprehensive appraisal of someone evaluating a new environment, and said, "That cable run on the south wall is a code violation." Ethan had looked at the cable run. It was the one the previous owner had installed before he bought the property, the one he'd been meaning to address since approximately the previous owner's era. "I know," he said. "I'm fixing it next week." "I can fix it today," she said. "If you have the materials." He had the materials. She fixed it that afternoon during her lunch break, which was not the assignment he'd given her, and also exactly the kind of initiative that told him Dale's referral had been right. The 3 of them worked well together in the unspectacular way that people worked well together when they each knew what they were doing and respected the others who did. There weren't team-building exercises or motivational speeches. There was the work, and there were 3 people who took the work seriously, and that was the whole of the culture, which turned out to be sufficient. He called Sophia on a Thursday evening 6 weeks after the 30-day review because she'd asked him to update her after the second bay came online. "Victor delivered on time," he said. "Victor weeks turned out to be regular weeks." "He's a good contractor." "You're going to say that about everyone you work with." "No," Ethan said. "I say it about the ones who earn it." A brief pause. "How does it feel? The second bay?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Like something I've been intending for 6 years finally being real," he said, "which is mostly good and slightly disorienting." "Disorienting how? Like when you finally fix a problem you've lived with so long that the absence of the problem takes some getting used to." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific feeling." "You've had it." "Constantly," she said. "The first year we turned a profit, the first time we hit 50 employees. There's this moment where the thing you were working toward arrives, and instead of just feeling good, you also feel off balance, like you'd built your identity around the effort, and now the effort has changed shape." "Yeah," he said. "That's it. You get used to the new shape." "When?" A brief sound that was the beginning of a laugh. "Honestly, right around when the next problem arrives, and you have to build around that one." He smiled at the phone, there in the office corner of his shop after the crew had gone home, the evening light coming through the windows at a low angle. Phil mentioned Q2 expansion. Phil is cautious. He's usually right to be cautious, and occasionally overcautious. My read is you're ready for the additional 18 machines. "I want to hear his 6 weeks first." "That's also my read," she said. "I'm not going to push the timeline. I'm telling you it's coming." "Okay." A pause that had something comfortable in it, the comfort of 2 people who'd established enough of a working relationship that silence wasn't awkward. "Ethan," she said, "how's your daughter?" He looked at the shop. The 2 lifts visible through the office corner opening, the organized workbench, the management software on the tablet, its screen showing 6 open work orders in various stages of completion. "She finished her book," he said. "The one about the spider?" "She started a new one. She's been writing something of her own, too, a story she won't show me." "How long has she been writing it?" "Months now. Every Saturday she's here, she takes out the notebook. I've stopped asking about it because every time I ask, she turns it away." "She'll show you when it's done," Sophia said. "That's what she tells me." "She sounds like someone who takes her work seriously." "She does," Ethan said. "I don't know where she gets it." Sophia didn't say anything to that, which was the right response because the answer was obvious and saying it would have been too easy. He took Lily to the field trip in September, not as a chaperone. Mrs. Calloway hadn't asked for chaperones until the previous year's incident with the 3rd grader and the butterfly exhibit, the details of which Ethan had never fully gotten out of Lily. He took her because the field trip was to the Kentucky Science Center in Louisville, which required a bus that left from the school at 7 in the morning, and he liked to be the one to put her on the bus. It was a Thursday, so he drove her to school early and stood with her in the parking lot, in the September morning cool while the bus idled and Mrs. Calloway checked names off her list with the focused efficiency of someone managing 12 eight-year-olds on a field trip. Lily was wearing a yellow backpack and had her hair braided, which she'd done herself that morning with varying success. One braid tighter than the other, which she'd noticed and dismissed with the pragmatism of someone who had decided the asymmetry was acceptable and was not revisiting the decision. She had the notebook in her backpack. She'd told him that morning at breakfast that she was bringing it. "Are you going to work on it at the Science Center?" he asked. "Maybe on the bus," she said. "When it's boring." "The bus might not be boring." "It'll be boring for the first part," she said, with the confidence of someone who had ridden school buses before. He stood with her while they waited. The other kids arrived with their parents, the particular morning energy of children who were going somewhere different today, the slightly elevated noise and movement of it. Lily stood beside him with the yellow backpack, quiet in the way she was usually quiet in crowds. Not shy, just observing, taking it in with the attention she brought to things. He thought about how she'd looked at the school's field trip envelope from the kitchen counter for what he'd later understood were several days before he'd addressed it. The way she'd already looked up the price. $35, that had once felt like the kind of $35 you did math about, and now, not easily, not without thought, but genuinely, was just $35. He thought about how slowly the thing had changed and how you only really knew it had changed when you looked back at the point it had been different. "Dad?" Lily put her hand briefly on his arm. It was the same gesture she'd made at the kitchen table months ago when he'd been setting up the management software. Brief, matter of fact. "Yeah. You're doing the face." "What face?" "The thinking one." She looked up at him. "It's fine. I know you're not worried." "How do you know that?" "Because you would have said something by now if you were worried about something real." She hoisted her backpack straps. "Mrs. Calloway is calling my name." He looked. Mrs. Calloway was indeed calling her name, checking it off the list. He crouched down briefly and she hugged him. A real one this time, arms around his neck, the yellow backpack pressing against his shoulder. Then she pulled back, straightened up, and walked toward the bus with the decisive step of someone who had a plan for the day and intended to execute it. He watched her get on the bus. She found a window seat near the middle and looked out at him and gave a brief wave that was more acknowledgement than performance. He waved back. The bus pulled out. He drove to the shop. Dale was already there when he arrived, coffee made, the first work order of the day pulled up on his tablet. Tanya arrived 10 minutes later, changed into her work clothes in the small bathroom near the office, and was at her bay by 7:40. The day organized itself around the work the way it always did now. The comfortable, demanding rhythm of a shop that had enough work to fill its days and enough people who knew what they were doing to meet it. At 11 o'clock, Ethan was in the middle of a diagnostic on a harvester header that Phil's team had flagged as priority when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. The diagnostic was at a stage where stopping was inconvenient, but he looked at the screen and saw it was Sophia and answered. "I have news," she said. Something in her voice was different, not urgent, but alive in a way that was different from the professional voice she used for operational calls. "Good or bad?" he said. "Depends how you feel about the Farm Equipment Manufacturers Association." He straightened up from the harvester. "I don't have feelings about them." "You might develop some." A brief pause. "They have an annual Excellence in Service Award. It's given to independent repair operations that demonstrate a specific combination of technical quality, customer documentation, and ethical practice. They survey equipment owners, review service records, look at complaint histories." Ethan was still. "Phil submitted your operation for consideration 3 weeks ago," Sophia said, "without telling me, which means he either forgot to mention it or decided it was the kind of thing he could do without checking with me first, which for Phil is a notable shift." Ethan looked at the harvester, looked at Dale across the shop floor. "I didn't win it," he said, "because that was the most likely conclusion." "You're a finalist," Sophia said, "which in 22 years of this award being given, no operation in its first year of full commercial operation has ever been." He didn't say anything. "Ethan, I heard you." "Phil doesn't submit names for things he doesn't believe in," she said. "He submitted yours." He put his free hand on the side of the harvester. The metal was warm from the shop. He could feel the texture of it. Old paint, slight surface rust in the seam where the panel met the frame. The small physical reality of a machine that existed and had problems and needed someone to pay attention to it. "When do they announce?" he said. "Industry conference in Louisville, December." December was 3 months away. "Okay," he said. "That's all you have to say?" He thought about what he had to say. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel about something like that," he said honestly. "I'm still figuring out how to feel about the second bay being done." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said, and the way she said it meant she actually did know. Had been there herself, in some version of it. "Is Phil there?" Ethan said. "Can you—" "He's in Louisville this week. When he gets back, will you tell him—" He stopped. "What did you tell a man who'd spent 3 months looking for reasons to doubt you and then submitted your name for an industry award?" "Tell him what?" Sophia said. "Tell him I said thank you," Ethan said, "and that I'll try to deserve it." A pause. "I'll tell him," she said. "He'll say something like he should." "That's fine," Ethan said. "That's exactly fine." He hung up the phone, stood next to the harvester for a moment in the particular quiet that settled over things that needed to settle. Through the office window, he could see the parking lot, the fresh asphalt they'd laid in July, the 2 parking spaces that were actually usable now that the Pontiac had finally been moved, the Langford company truck that Phil's team had dropped last week for a service interval. He thought about Lily on the bus, going to the science center with her uneven braids and her notebook in her yellow backpack. He picked up his diagnostic tablet and went back to the harvester. The header wasn't going to diagnose itself. The morning was half gone, and there were 5 open work orders, and Tanya had a question about a part substitution that needed his sign-off, and the afternoon had its own things in it that hadn't arrived yet. He thought about December, briefly, and then let it go, because December was December and this was now, and the harvester had a fault that was somewhere in the real drive system, and finding it required his complete attention. Dale looked up from his own work across the floor. He had a way of registering when something had happened without having heard it, which was the attentiveness of a man who'd spent decades reading machines by the sounds they made and had extended that same attention to the people around him. He looked at Ethan with a question in his expression that didn't require words. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not negatively, but in the way you shook your head when the thing was real, but you weren't ready to say it out loud yet. Dale went back to his work. The shop ran. Outside, beyond the parking lot and the county road, and the distance to Louisville and the distance to Nashville, things continued being what they were. The season turning, the farms running their equipment against the September deadline that farming ran against every year, the relentless calendar of planting and harvest and preparation for the next cycle. Somewhere in that calendar, in fields Ethan had never seen, machines he'd serviced were running the way machines were supposed to run, doing their work in the long rows under the Kentucky sky, doing it because someone had paid attention to them, had found the failing part and replaced it, and put the whole thing back together and sent it out into the world to do what it was built to do. That was all any of it was, when you got to the bottom of it. Paying attention, doing the work that was in front of you as well as you could do it, showing up the next day and doing it again. He found the fault in the reel drive at 215, a sheared key on the drive shaft, small as a thumbnail, doing exactly what a sheared key did, which was prevent everything downstream of it from functioning. He pulled it, measured it, had the replacement in his parts stock, because he'd learned to keep replacement keys for every drive shaft in the Langford fleet after the second time he'd had to wait 2 days for one. He installed the new key, reassembled the reel drive, ran the header through its cycle twice to confirm, and logged the completed work order at 3:40 with the parts used and the labor hours and the diagnostic notes that Phil Derry's team would have in their records by end of day. He looked at the completed entry on the tablet. Then he looked at the shop around him. Dale closing up the work order on the tractor he'd finished, Tanya pressure washing the second bay floor with the thoroughness that was just the way she did things, the late afternoon light coming through the high windows and laying in long strips across the concrete. He thought, briefly, about the man who'd owned this building before him, the previous owner who'd put in that non-code cable run and never fixed the floor crack and let the south roof go until the water stain in the back room was a permanent feature of the landscape. He didn't think badly of that man. He thought about what it meant to be in a place and not have the resources or the energy or the future to maintain it, and about what it meant to have those things and use them. He picked up his phone and texted Lily. How was the science center? She texted back 11 minutes later, which meant the bus was somewhere between Louisville and Millhaven. Good. They had a thing about bridges. I have a question about load distribution. He smiled at the phone. Ask me when you get home, he typed back. I already wrote it down, she replied. He put the phone in his pocket and went to help Tanya with the bay. The question about load distribution turned out to be more involved than Ethan had expected. Lily had written it in the notebook, not the story notebook, a different one she'd started keeping for questions, which he'd discovered was a separate project from the story and had its own organizational logic he didn't fully understand. The question was about how weight distributed across a suspension bridge versus an arch bridge, and why the Kentucky Science Center exhibit had shown them differently, and whether that was why some bridges lasted longer than others, or if longevity was a different variable entirely. He sat at the kitchen table with her for 45 minutes that evening, drawing diagrams on the back of an envelope, explaining tension and compression, and the difference between a load that was pulled and a load that was pushed. She asked follow-up questions with the relentless specificity of someone who wouldn't accept a partially complete answer, and he found himself going further than he'd intended. Into materials science, into why concrete behaved differently under tension than under compression, into the reason a cable could hold enormous weight pulling down but would buckle immediately if you tried to push it. At some point she stopped writing and just listened. The notebook closed in front of her, her chin in her hand. What? He said. Nothing. She looked at him. You like explaining things. I like understanding things. Same thing though, kind of. He thought about that. Maybe, he said. She picked up the notebook and wrote something, and he didn't ask what. That night, after she was asleep, he sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and thought about December. The Farm Equipment Manufacturers Association conference in Louisville. The finalist announcement that Sophia had delivered with that particular alive quality in her voice. He thought about Phil Derry submitting the nomination without telling anyone, which was the act of a man who'd moved past skepticism into something else, something that had taken 4 months and a utility tractor service and a 30-day review and 6 weeks of documented performance data to produce. He thought about what winning would mean and what not winning would mean, and concluded honestly that the finalist designation was already more external acknowledgement than he'd had in 12 years of doing this work, and that if it stayed there, if December came and the award went to someone else, it would still be true that Phil Derry had looked at his operation after 3 months and thought, this is worth nominating. That was not a small thing. He went to bed at 11. He was asleep before 11:15, which was the sleep of someone who'd used their body during the day in a way that made arguments against sleep irrelevant. October arrived, and with it, the Q2 expansion that Phil had been holding off on. 18 additional machines from Langford's Central Kentucky cluster, which extended the geographic range of Ethan's service territory significantly and required the mobile service operation to run more days than it didn't. He bought the second service truck in October, a used F550 with a utility bed that he spent 2 weekends converting with Dale, adding the tool storage and the parts drawers and the generator mount that made it functional rather than just a truck with potential. Dale ran the mobile operation most days. He did it with the same methodical quality he brought to shop work, which was not guaranteed. Mobile service had a different rhythm from shop work, more improvisation, more decision-making without the full complement of tools available, and some mechanics who were exceptional in a shop were less exceptional when the shop was the back of a truck on a farm road. Dale was not one of those mechanics. He came back from mobile calls with complete documentation and specific parts requests, and occasionally observations about other issues he'd noticed on machines that weren't on his call sheet, but that he thought someone should know about. Ethan had started passing those observations to Phil, formatted as what he called informational service notes. Not invoiced items, just documentation. Equipment manager so-and-so's machine shows early wear on component X, worth monitoring at next scheduled service. Phil had commented on these after the second month. You're doing free work. I'm building a record, Ethan had said. And I'd rather tell you about a problem 3 months before it becomes a breakdown than get a priority call at 6 in the morning. A pause. That's a reasonable position. Also, it's the right thing to do. Another pause, shorter. Also that, Phil said. Tanya had taken on more diagnostic responsibility as the volume grew, which had happened organically rather than through any formal restructuring. She had a specific gift for electrical fault diagnosis that was faster than Ethan's and arguably faster than Dale's, and the modern agricultural equipment running through the shop had more electrical complexity than the machines Ethan had been trained on. He recognized the gap in his own knowledge and did something about it. Ordered 3 technical manuals for the current generation of precision agriculture equipment, read them over 2 weeks in the evenings, enrolled in a 2-day manufacturer training course in Lexington in November that he'd been putting off because taking 2 days away from the shop felt irresponsible. He went. The shop ran without him. Tanya handled 2 priority calls. Dale handled a mobile run and a major repair. And when Ethan came back, he reviewed the work orders and found nothing he'd have done differently, which was both reassuring and slightly humbling in the way that discovering you're not the only competent person in the room was always slightly humbling. He came back from Lexington with 3 new diagnostic certifications and a different understanding of the electrical architecture on the newer combine models, and he sat down with Tanya the morning after his return and went through what he'd learned, because there was no point in knowing something your team didn't know. Tanya listened, asked 2 questions that were better than most of the questions the other people in the training course had asked, and then said, "There's a training module for this on the manufacturer's portal. I've been working through it on my lunch breaks." He looked at her. "Since when?" "Since the R-Series combine came in September and I wanted to understand the integrated hydraulic system better." He thought about the cable run she'd fixed on her first day. "Have you finished it?" 2 weeks ago." He thought about what you said to someone who improved themselves on their lunch break without mentioning it or expecting credit. There wasn't a good thing to say exactly. There was just the acknowledgement. "Good," he said. "That's good, Tanya." She nodded and went back to work. That was the whole conversation, and it was sufficient. Bob. November was the month he hired a 4th person. He hadn't planned to hire in November. The workload justified it. Had justified it for about 6 weeks before he acted, but every time he sat down to write a job posting, he found reasons to wait. The transition from 3 to 4 felt different from the transition from 1 to 3. 3 people was still a small operation, the kind where he knew the rhythms of each person, where communication was direct and problems surfaced quickly because there was no layer between anyone and anyone else. 4 was the number where you started needing something more deliberate, where the culture of the place had to be more explicit because it couldn't be entirely carried by proximity and habit. He talked to Dale about it one afternoon. In the offhand way, he'd started having serious conversations, sideways, while both of them were working on something, which made the conversation easier to have honestly. "I keep putting off the hiring," he said. "I know," Dale said. "What are you seeing, from where you sit?" Dale was quiet for a moment, torquing a bolt with the steady application of force that was just his natural pace. "I'm seeing Tanya carrying too much diagnostic load, and I'm seeing you doing shop work and business work at the same time, and doing neither as well as you do each one separately. Which one should I give up?" "You can't give up the shop work yet," Dale said. "You don't know enough about the business end to run it without checking your own assumptions against the work. In a year, maybe 2, you could step back. Right now, you need both." He paused. "So you hire someone who takes load off Tanya, another mechanic, not a senior one. You don't need another senior one. You need someone solid who can handle standard service intervals and frees Tanya for the complex work." Ethan thought about it. "Where do I find them?" "I put out a word already," Dale said. "There's a young guy in Pineville who lost his job when the equipment rental place downsized. Good fundamentals. Needs mentorship, but not much." "You already put out a word." 2 weeks ago." Ethan put down the tool he was holding and looked at Dale across the hood of the machine between them. "You could have told me." "I was waiting for you to get there on your own," Dale said. "You make better decisions when you reach them yourself than when someone tells you to." This was either the most sensible personnel management Ethan had ever encountered, or a subtle indication that Dale had strong opinions about how Ethan made decisions. Possibly both. The young man from Pineville was named Marcus Gaines, no relation to the lawyer Marcus Webb, a coincidence that Ethan mentioned and Marcus Gaines found less interesting than Ethan did. He was 26, compact and precise in his movements, with a particular brand of quietness that meant he was paying attention rather than being disengaged. He came in for a trial week and did what Dale had said: solid fundamentals, needed direction on anything outside his experience, absorbed the direction quickly, and applied it without needing to be told twice. Ethan hired him at the end of the trial week. Marcus Gaines shook his hand with the composed relief of someone who'd needed the job and had been doing the math on whether the week had gone well enough, which it clearly had. 4 people now. The shop running 3 bays on rotation, the mobile unit out 3 to 4 days a week. A management system that logged everything and that Ethan reviewed every Sunday morning for an hour before the week began, looking for patterns, for things that were working well and needed protecting, for things that were fraying and needed attention. He thought sometimes about the spiral notebook. It was still on the workbench. He kept it there, not as a working tool, but as a fact, a reminder of what the starting point had been. The distance between the spiral notebook and the management system on the tablet was not just a software upgrade. It was 1.5 years of decisions, most of them made under uncertainty, most of them made without full information, all of them made with the same basic principle that had apparently started this whole thing. Do the work right, charge what's fair, tell the truth. It was not a complicated principle. Ethan had never thought it was particularly remarkable. The remarkable thing, it turned out, was how rare it was in practice. Not because people were dishonest by nature, but because the pressures of running a business at the margin created 1,000 small opportunities to cut a corner, to charge for something you didn't quite do, to tell a customer what they wanted to hear rather than what was true. Every one of those opportunities was a small test, and most people failed some of them most of the time. Not because they were bad people, but because they were under pressure and the corner was right there. He hadn't failed them. Not because he was exceptional, but because he'd decided early that failing them would cost him something he cared about more than the short-term gain. He'd made that decision in a context where the stakes seemed small. A woman with a broken tractor, a bill he could have inflated and didn't. And it turned out that the context hadn't been small at all. He thought about this sometimes without quite knowing what to do with it. It wasn't a lesson he could have taught himself in advance. It was the kind of thing you only understood looking backward. December came cold and early to eastern Kentucky, the kind of cold that arrived in the first week of the month and made clear it intended to stay until March. Ethan drove to Louisville on a Wednesday morning with Dale in the passenger seat, because Dale had said he was coming and Ethan hadn't thought of a good reason to tell him not to. They drove mostly in silence, which was their natural mode. The highway ran through country that was bare-treed and gray in the December morning, the hills stripped of their summer cover, the sky the color of old aluminum. Dale drank coffee from a thermos he'd brought and read something on his phone with the absorbed quiet of a man comfortable with long silences. Ethan drove and thought about nothing in particular, which was the specific quality of thought that happened on long highway drives and was different from thinking about something in that it was generative rather than directed. The conference was at a hotel in downtown Louisville, smaller than the Nashville Summit, but with the same concentrated energy of an industry gathering. Ethan checked in at the registration desk and got a badge and found the ballroom where the awards dinner was being held, and sat at the table that had his name on a small card beside the place setting. There were 8 finalists for the Excellence in Service Award. Their names were on a card in the program. 4 of them represented operations larger than Ethan's. 3 were comparable in size. 1, a shop in rural Indiana, was smaller. Ethan read through this program descriptions while the room filled up around him and the dinner service began with the organized efficiency of hotel catering, bread baskets appearing and water glasses being filled by people in white shirts who moved through the room with practiced invisibility. Dale sat across from him and ate bread and looked at the room with the comprehensive assessment he gave to every new environment. "Nice place," he said. "Nashville was bigger." "Bigger isn't always better," Dale poured water. "You nervous?" "A little." "Good," Dale said. "Means you care." The dinner proceeded the way industry awards dinners proceeded. Speeches, award presentations in several categories, The particular combination of genuine celebration and professional networking that characterized events where people who competed with each other also needed each other. Ethan ate what was in front of him and listened and participated in the table conversation with the other nominees at his table, who turned out to be, most of them, people he'd have liked to talk to at a different time about the actual work. The Excellence in Service Award was the last one of the evening. The presenter was a woman named Dr. Caroline Marsh, who chaired the association's Standards Committee, and she spoke about the award's history, 22 years, criteria that had evolved but maintained their core purpose, with the focused brevity of someone who respected the audience's time. She spoke about what the award was trying to identify: not size, not revenue, not growth metrics. The specific combination of technical quality, documentation integrity, and ethical practice that was, she said without dramatization, becoming harder to find as the industry consolidated and the pressure towards speed and volume made the slower, harder work of doing things right increasingly economically inconvenient. Ethan listened to this with the specific attention of someone hearing something described that matched their own experience from a different angle. She named the winner, Cross Automotive and Repair, Millhaven, Kentucky. The room applauded. Dale was already standing before Ethan processed that he should stand. He stood. He walked to the front of the room with the same steadying thought he'd had in Nashville when Sophia had asked him to stand in front of 2,000 people. "I'm here. That's enough. Walk forward." Dr. Marsh handed him a plaque, heavier than he'd expected, which was a detail he registered with the clarity that small physical details acquired in moments of heightened attention. She shook his hand. She said something to him directly, not into the microphone. "The nomination documentation from your fleet client was the most specific we've received in 12 years. Not superlatives, specifics." He thought of Phil Derry typing a nomination he hadn't told anyone about. "Thank you," Ethan said. They handed him a microphone. He hadn't prepared anything. He'd told himself not to prepare anything because preparing something implied assuming he'd win, and assuming you'd win something felt like the wrong relationship to have with an uncertain outcome. So he stood at the front of the room with a plaque in one hand and a microphone in the other, and the faces of several hundred industry professionals looking at him, and said what was true. "I have a 2-bay shop, well, 3 bays now, in a town most people haven't heard of," he said. "I started this year with 1 bay and a spiral notebook. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. This award isn't about what I built. It's about how I try to work." He paused. A real pause, not a rhetorical one. "I had a customer this past summer who came in with a broken tractor, an urgent need and real concern about the cost. I fixed the machine. I charged what I thought was fair. I didn't know who she was. I wouldn't have done anything differently if I had." Another pause. "That's the whole story, honestly. The rest of it, the expansion, the contract, being here, came from that one job. And what I take from that is not that you should be honest, because good things will happen to you if you are. Sometimes they don't. The take is that you should be honest because it's the way the work deserves to be done. The work is real. The people who need it are real. The least you can do is be real too." He stopped. He'd said enough. He wasn't going to push it further because he could feel the boundary where more would be too much, and he'd always been better at knowing when something was finished than at knowing how to start it. The room applauded. He walked back to his table. Dale was standing and clapping with the focused energy of a man who had an opinion about what had just happened and was expressing it through his palms. Ethan sat down. Put the plaque on the table in front of him. Looked at it. Dale sat back down. "Good speech." "I didn't prepare anything." "I know." Dale picked up his water glass. "That's why it was good." He got home late that night, after midnight. Mrs. Garrity had kept Lily, and he'd told her he'd be late, and she'd said that was fine without making it complicated, which was the particular grace of someone who'd been helping him with that exact problem for 3 years. He went to bed. He lay in the dark of the back room. Not the hotel room, his back room, with the water stain on the ceiling that he'd finally gotten around to patching properly last month, that still showed a faint outline of where it had been. And he thought about the plaque on his passenger seat in the drive home through the dark Kentucky hills, and Lily asleep 3 blocks away at Mrs. Garrity's. He thought about the speech, about what he'd said at the end, and whether he meant it or whether he'd said it because it was the right thing to say in that room. He held it up and looked at it honestly, the way he looked at any claim that mattered, and concluded he meant it. The thing about honesty not being strategic, not being a bet on good outcomes, he meant it. He'd been honest about the bill on a broken tractor because the alternative was something he wasn't willing to be, full stop. The consequences of that had been extraordinary and also, in some important sense, beside the point. The point had been the woman in the chair with the sandwich and the worry in her eyes, and the right thing to charge, and the work done the way it deserved to be done. Everything else had been afterward. He went to sleep. In the morning, he picked up Lily from Mrs. Garrity's before she was fully awake, a familiar routine. Lily in her pajamas and a coat Mrs. Garrity had put on her, carrying her overnight bag and the story notebook and her shoes in her hands because she hadn't put them on yet. Walking to his truck with the slightly blurred quality of a child who was awake enough to move but not awake enough to perform being awake. He helped her with her seatbelt. She leaned against the window and closed her eyes for the 3-block drive home, which she did sometimes, not sleeping, just resting in the way children rested when they'd been somewhere that wasn't home, and home was almost but not quite arrived. He got her inside, made her toast. She ate it at the kitchen table with increasing consciousness, her braids from yesterday partially escaped, her feet in wool socks on the chair rungs. "Did you win?" she said, when she'd gotten enough toast in her to be fully present. He told her about the finalist designation. He'd kept it low-key because he hadn't wanted her to invest in the outcome, and also because he hadn't wanted to himself. "Yeah," he said, "I won." She looked at him. Her face did something that was not excitement exactly. She was not an excited reaction child, never had been, but was more serious than usual, the expression of someone who understood the weight of something. "Can I see the plaque?" she said. He got it from the bag he'd brought in from the truck, handed it to her. She held it with both hands, read it carefully, the inscription, the organization name, the year, and then set it on the table in front of her and looked at it the way she looked at things she was committing to memory. "It's heavy," she said. "I know. Where are you going to put it?" He hadn't thought about that. "The shop, I guess. Somewhere visible." She considered this. "Not over the workbench," she said. "That's where the tools live, somewhere separate." She looked at him. "By the door, where people come in." "That's a good idea," he said. She nodded as though this was obvious and picked up her toast. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. The December morning light was thin and white through the kitchen window. The heat was running, a sound he'd learned to not hear but was always there. "Lily," he said. She looked up. "The story. In the notebook. Is it done?" She looked at the notebook on the table beside her. She'd been carrying it everywhere for 6 months, the spiral notebook that she turned away from him whenever he tried to see it. She looked at it for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she slid it across the table to him. He looked at her. She went back to her toast. He opened the notebook. The story began on the 3rd page, after 2 pages of notes and crossed-out starts that she'd left in, the evidence of the work it had taken to get to the beginning she wanted. The handwriting was careful and large, the handwriting of a child who was taking this seriously, who had decided to form each letter deliberately. There was a man who fixed things. It began. He wasn't magic. He just paid attention. He read it slowly. It was 11 pages, handwritten, with small drawings in the margins. A tractor, a tool, what was clearly meant to be a conference building, a girl with braids who appeared in several scenes watching from the edge of events. The story was not exactly his story. The man in it was named something else, had slightly different circumstances, lived in a town with a different name. But the shape of it was his shape, and the girl with the braids was clearly herself, and the woman with the tractor was clearly Sophia, and the thing the story was about, the thing Lily had been working to articulate in her 11 pages of careful handwriting, was something she'd watched unfold from inside the yellow backpack and the kitchen table and the Saturday mornings at the workbench. The last paragraph read, "He didn't fix things because he wanted something in return. He fixed things because broken things deserve to be whole. That's what his daughter learned from watching him, and she wrote it down so she wouldn't forget." Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his daughter's notebook in his hands and said nothing for a while. Lily ate her toast. She didn't look at him, which he understood was deliberate. She'd given him the notebook, and now she was giving him the space to read it without her watching him read it. "Lily," he said when he could say something. "Yeah. This is—" He stopped. Started again. "This is really good." She looked at him now. "You're not just saying that?" "When have I ever just said something?" She thought about this. "Never," she said, which was the honest answer. "It's really good," he said again. She looked at the notebook, at him. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached across the table and took the notebook back, closed it, held it against her chest for a moment. "I'm going to make it better," she said. "It's not done. It's just done enough to show you." He looked at her. 8 years old, story in a notebook. Question about load distribution. Uneven braids she'd decided were acceptable. "Okay," he said. She got up and went to her room with the notebook. He sat with his coffee and looked at the kitchen table and thought about 11 pages of careful handwriting and the last paragraph and what it meant that his daughter had been watching all of it with the specific attention of someone who intended to write it down. The call from Sophia came 2 days later. He was in the shop when she called, in the new third bay, the one that Victor's crew had finished in November, walking Marcus Gaines through the diagnostic procedure on a combine's grain elevator system. He saw her name and said to Marcus, "Give me 5 minutes," and stepped into the parking lot. The December air was sharp. He could see his breath. "I heard," she said, "about the award. Phil texted me from Louisville." "Phil was there?" A brief pause. "He drove up. He didn't tell me he was going." Another pause, shorter. "He texted me when they announced it. He said, and I'm going to read this exactly, 'Told you so, drinks on you,' which is Phil Derry's version of being moved." Ethan looked at the parking lot, the company truck, the fresh asphalt, the sign on the building which he'd repainted in October. Same words, Cross Automotive and Repair, but the paint was no longer peeling on the left side. "Tell him he was right," Ethan said. "He knows he was right. He's Phil. Tell him anyway." A small pause. "I will." Another pause, longer. "I want to talk to you about next year." "Okay." "We're opening a new operation in southern Indiana, about 800 acres, different crop profile than our Kentucky clusters. We'll be running 60-plus units up there within 18 months. She paused. "It's outside your current contract territory." He waited. "I want to expand the contract," she said. "New territory, new equipment profile. It would require you to establish a satellite operation, not a full shop, a managed mobile service hub. Probably 2 mechanics up there, running out of a facility you'd lease or build, coordinating with your Millhaven base." The cold air moved through the parking lot. Somewhere down the county road, a truck was going past, the sound of it fading in the December quiet. "That's a significant expansion," he said. "I know. I'd need 6 months to structure it properly." "I wasn't asking for it next month. I'd need to talk to Dale and Tanya about whether they want to be part of growing it or whether growing it changes something about what the work is for them." "That's the right conversation to have. And I'd need the numbers to make sense on the satellite operation before I commit. Not your numbers. The actual numbers for what it would cost me to run it, what the contract would need to pay for it to be worth doing." "I'd expect nothing less," Sophia said. He looked at the sign on the building, the fresh paint. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "How do you decide? When to expand, when to hold? How do you know the difference?" A pause that was thoughtful rather than uncertain. "I used to think I knew," she said. "I had frameworks, criteria, decision matrices. I believed in the matrices." A brief pause. "Now I think you know when the thing you're expanding is still the same thing at the core, when the growth is adding capacity to what you already are, rather than becoming something different to chase a number." Another pause. "Your shop is still your shop. Adding a satellite, if it's run by people who share how you work, that's still your shop. If it's not worth doing." He thought about Dale saying 2 weeks ago, about a question. "I was waiting for you to get there on your own. You make better decisions when you reach them yourself. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. Sophia. He stopped. Yeah. Thank you. For... He didn't finish that sentence because the thing it was reaching for was too large to name accurately in a phone call in a parking lot. The tractor. The conference. The contract. The nomination Phil had submitted because the relationship had gotten to a place where Phil believed in it. The way all of it had unfolded from one afternoon when a woman with dirty jeans had driven a broken machine into his lot, and he'd done what he always did, which was look at it honestly and fix it right and tell the truth about the cost. You don't have to say it, Sophia said. I know, he said. I wanted to anyway. A pause that had warmth in it. Merry Christmas, Ethan. Merry Christmas, he said. He stood in the parking lot for another minute after the call ended. The cold was the clean, dry cold of December in Kentucky. Not harsh, but present. The kind of cold that made the world look slightly sharper, the outlines of things more definite. He thought about Lily's story. He didn't fix things because he wanted something in return. He fixed things because broken things deserved to be whole. He thought about the spiral notebook still on the workbench, the water stain outline still faintly visible on the patched ceiling of the back room. The Pontiac finally gone from the parking lot, sold to a kid in Harlan for parts. The plaque that he'd hung by the front door the morning after Louisville, in the place Lily had said, not over the workbench, somewhere separate, where people came in. He went back inside. Marcus was waiting at the combine, patient and ready. The grain elevator system was not going to diagnose itself. The morning had its work in it, and the work was real, and the work was what it had always been and what it would continue to be. Not a path to something else, not a means to a larger end, but the thing itself, the actual substance of the days, which deserved to be done right because it was real, and because the people who needed it were real, and because that was the only basis on which any of it made sense. He picked up the diagnostic tablet, looked at the combine, looked at Marcus. Okay, he said, let's find the problem. And they did what they always did. They went to work. But there is a version of this kind of story where the ending is a number. A revenue figure, a head count, a square footage of expanded facility, some measure of scale that the audience can hold and say, that's how much it changed. Those numbers are real. They exist in Ethan's story, and they're not small. But the number isn't the ending. The ending is a Tuesday morning the following spring, when Ethan Cross is in the third bay running a diagnostic, and Lily stops by after school with her backpack and her notebook, the story notebook, version 2, which she started in January after she decided the first version was good enough to show him, but not good enough to stop working on. She installs herself at the workbench with her pencil and her focused crease between her eyebrows, and she works on the story in the background of the shop noise, and he works on the machine in the foreground of it, and neither of them has to say anything for any of it to be understood. Dale is in Bay 2, talking to Marcus about the PTO engagement on a tractor they've seen before. Tanya is on a mobile call 60 miles away, with her voice on the shop radio because she's hit a diagnostic question she wants Dale's eyes on. The management system has 11 open work orders. There's a new work order coming in, a call from Phil Derry's team about a combine in the new Indiana territory that's showing a fault code on the header control module. And Ethan has already pulled up the service manual on his tablet and started reading before he's committed to taking the call. Phil calls at 4:15. Header control module fault, C-Series combine, Southern Indiana cluster, Phil says. I know, I got the alert. A brief pause. You read the alert before I called. I read the manual before you called. The pause is short this time. The satellite team can't get to it until tomorrow morning. That's fine. It'll wait until morning. It's not running hot, it's just throwing a code. Log it as low priority and have your guy document the active faults so we have the full picture when he gets there. Already done, Phil says. A pause that is easy on both ends, the pause of two people who have learned each other well enough that silence is efficient rather than awkward. Phil, Ethan says. Yeah. Good system. He can hear Phil almost smile through the phone. Don't get sentimental. Never, Ethan says, and hangs up. Lily looks up from the workbench. She's been listening, the way she always listens. Not intrusively, just with the peripheral attention of someone who considers the shop part of her environment rather than a place she's visiting. Was that the Phil you told me about? She says. Yeah. The one who didn't believe in you at first? The one who was cautious, Ethan says. There's a difference. She looks at him for a moment. Is there? Caution is when you want to be right before you commit. Not believing is when you've already decided. He looks at the combine diagnostic on his tablet. Phil wanted to be right. He was. He just changed his mind about what right looked like. Lily considers this. She writes something in the notebook. Is that for the story? He says. Maybe, she says. He goes back to the diagnostic. The shop runs around him. The noise of tools and the radio and the distant voice of Tanya's call on the speaker. All of it the sound of a place that is doing what it exists to do. The afternoon light through the high windows is the long, warm light of spring, the kind that says the season has turned and the work outside is beginning again. The tractors going into the fields, the planters running in the long rows, all of it running on machines that needed to be right before they could do anything else. He thinks about a summer afternoon 2 years ago when a tractor had pulled into his lot and died, and a woman had climbed down with dirty jeans and a concern about the bill and 400 acres that needed planting and the time pressure of a season that did not negotiate. He thinks about the hours he'd spent in that engine, not because anyone was watching, but because the machine was broken and breaking things deserved better than being left broken. He doesn't think of that as the beginning of anything. He thinks of it as a Tuesday then, a job that came in, a customer who needed something. That's what it was. And what came from it came from it. And the thing that allowed what came from it was not exceptional intelligence or unusual luck or being in the right place at a moment when the world happened to be paying attention. It was just the work, done right, over and over, in the presence of nobody in particular, for no reason except that it was the right way to do it. That's the whole of the lesson, if there is one. The world doesn't always see it. People don't always reward it. Most of the time you just do it, and it goes unnoticed and you do it again. But somewhere in the unnoticed accumulation of doing things right, a character is built, quietly, without fanfare, the way a foundation is built, underground and invisible, until the thing on top of it needs to hold weight. And when the weight comes, and it comes for everyone eventually, in one form or another, what's underneath either holds or it doesn't. Ethan Cross is in Bay 3 with his diagnostic tablet and his 4-person crew and his 3 bays and his management system and his plaque by the front door. He is 34 years old. He has a daughter who is writing her second draft of a story about someone like him and who will probably, he suspects, write a third draft after that and maybe a fourth, because she has learned from somewhere, and he is not entirely sure where, that good things take more than one pass. The Combine's header control module is going to wait until morning. The morning is going to come. He does the work that's in front of him now. That's all. That's everything.